Wi-Fi information. Everyone has that? Everyone all good? Okay, so is everyone here for the TLS HTTPS workshop? Yeah? If people could filter forward, I think this would be really helpful just because I will be showing some configuration stuff up here and you're going to have a hard time reading it back there. Also, there's power all along the first couple rows. So if you like power, come to the front. I really appreciate that. It's hard to speak to a huge room when it's all spread out, so thank you. All right, well, let's jump into this. My name is Zach Tolman. I'm an application engineer for Wired.com. And one of my interests is HTTPS and TLS. I really like working where our application code meets our infrastructure. And one of my interests over the last few years has been TLS. TLS is pretty hard to understand. There's a lot that goes into the protocol. And we are in this age where HTTPS is extremely important because of mass surveillance concerns. We want to be able to offer users of our sites encrypted connections so that nothing can be tampered with, their activity can't be followed, those sorts of things. And unfortunately, we're kind of bad at configuring TLS. So I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years looking into this, figuring this out. And the title of my talk, or this workshop, is HTTPS is coming. Are you prepared for this? If you haven't figured it out yet, TLS, it's really hot right now, right? It's all the rage. It's been in the news, unfortunately, quite a bit this week. There's been a lot of talk about encryption, encrypted communications. There's been revelations over the last few years about how much nation states have been following people, just collecting mass surveillance. And this has really kind of ignited a whole new interest in being able to secure our sites using good TLS. It's also led to a lot of vulnerabilities being found in TLS, which has led to more innovations, better service. I think the Internet Engineering Task Force said this really well. They declared that pervasive monitoring is a technical attack that should be mitigated in the design of all IETF protocols where possible. This is their statement saying that we need to think about pervasive monitoring. People just sitting on our connections, just sucking up data, and then maybe not using that right now, but perhaps in the future using that for some other reason. And the IETF said, when you put forth new protocols, new ideas, new standards, we need to take this into account. So where possible, we need to try to mitigate this type of attack. We've seen statements from Mozilla that have come out and said that they actually intend to deprecate non-secure HTTP. When they develop new features for Firefox browser, they intend to make them HTTPS only. Things like service workers, which have gotten a lot of attention recently, HTTPS only. They've come out and said that they intend to keep going that direction, and maybe in the future they would even deprecate some features that work with HTTP and make them HTTPS only. We've seen HTTP2 come out recently. This has been huge this year, and at this point, all major browser vendors support HTTP2 only over HTTPS. And I think this is particularly noteworthy in that the HTTP2 protocol does not specify that you have to have a TLS connection to do HTTP2. This is a huge point of contention when it went through the standards committees. And the browsers, once they kind of lost their fight to make the standard that HTTP2 is only over TLS, they came back and said, well, we kind of control how people connect to the internet, and we're only offering HTTP2 over HTTPS. And HTTP2 is pretty important in that it gives people a huge performance boost for their applications with very little overhead. All you need to do is get a TLS connection going, configure a few things, and you're good to go for HTTP2. So it's kind of a big carrot to get people to come towards TLS. The whole point I'm trying to make is that, and I've done some science here. This is a graph, that there's data backing this, right? Don't question where the data came from, just accept it. Right now, we have less TLS. We're moving to a future where there's more TLS. It's happening. right? And so as web developers, we need to make sure that we're able to establish good, secure HTTPS connections using TLS. I would argue that TLS is becoming essential knowledge for anyone that's involved in putting anything on the web. You know, no matter what your title is, what you do, you may be asked someday to configure a TLS connection, and you should know what you're doing when you're doing that. Because there's a problem, right? We're pushing everyone towards HTTPS, but all data available to us suggests that we're actually really bad at configuring TLS. We do a terrible job when we go out to establish these HTTPS connections. There's a site called SSL Pulse. It's put forth by the Trustworthy Internet Group. And what they do is they scan the top 300,000 Alexa sites on a monthly basis to get a sense of how well they're doing in terms of their HTTPS connections. The high-level statistics on what they find, the most recent data suggests that 68% of the sites that accept an HTTPS connection are not secure. This means that in their rating system from A to F, that it's received a B or lower. In their rating system, if you get a B or lower, that means you've failed to configure something properly in at least one of the key categories of TLS that we'll be talking about in a little bit. So that's pretty huge, right? In the top 300,000 Alexa websites, you know, hopefully if you're a top 3,000 website, you have some resources to get these things right. 68% of them are considered to be insecure. Another statistic is that 95% of the sites do not support HTTP strict transport security. This is a concept we're going to go into great detail about later on. Just for now, just recognize that this is one of the most important things that you can configure on your site to make sure you are, you're not susceptible to a type of man-in-the-middle attack aimed directly at HTTPS. 95% of these sites did not support it. And to support HTTP strict transport security is as easy as emitting a response header, right? We all probably know how to emit a response header somewhere in our application. 95% of sites are not doing this, and it's super important for security. 25% of sites do not support perfect forward secrecy. Perfect forward secrecy is another concept we're going to talk about quite a bit later, but basically for now, just recognize that perfect forward secrecy is an important security property that if everyone's communications to a website are being monitored, and then a key for the TLS encryption is compromised sometime later down the future, it could be, all those communications could be decrypted. If you use forward secrecy, getting a key for those communications will allow you to decrypt one connection, but not all of the connections. So it's really important to make sure that you're not allowing that possibility of mass surveillance plus, you know, cracking a key allows you access to that data. We're going to talk about this concept quite a bit in the future. Just suffice to say that this is a really important thing that you're deploying with your TLS applications, and 25% of sites are not doing it. If we look to some of the academic literature, Cronch and Bonneau did a study where they looked at sites that would try to configure some of the more advanced kind of setups for TLS, like are you using HTTP strict transport security? They studied the top 1 million Alexa websites, and what they found is that even the sites that were configuring HTTP strict transport security tend to kind of screw it up, and they concluded that misconfiguration errors are undermining the potential security of the protocol. In a similar study, Wong et al. Found that sites that tried to use some of the Diffie-Hellman key exchange parameters, they kind of screwed them up as well. We're going to talk a lot about Diffie-Hellman key exchange as we go on. What they found is that there's an industry-wide configuration problem with the deployment of Diffie-Hellman key exchange. All right, so I'm just going on and on and on and on, and I hope this is sinking in that we just don't seem to understand TLS. We seem to do a really, really poor job of configuring this. Let's fix that. Thank you all for coming to this presentation this morning. My goal is that nobody here is part of the 68%, that you're part of the 32% that's getting this right. All of us, you know, we may have that opportunity where someone says, okay, it's now your turn to configure TLS for our site. You want to be part of that 68%. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to spend a lot of time, this is going to feel like a talk for probably the first 2/3 of this, right? We're going to spend a lot of time understanding TLS. The thing about TLS is it seems easy to configure. As soon as you're asked to configure HTTPS for your site, You go, you Google, just like you do in most things, right? Like, how do I do this? And then you find a configuration, and you take your mouse and you drag all the way up, and then you plop that into your server, and you're like, hey, TLS, it's working, right? But who knows if you've gotten a good configuration, a bad configuration, or what? The problem with it is when you look at these configurations, they're difficult to understand. There's a big piece of this that's just going to make your brain explode, and then you say, well, I need to kind of get this done today, so whatever, let's move on. What I want you to do is have kind of a basis of knowledge to be able to evaluate what you're doing when you configure TLS. The irony here is in the end, when we actually configure TLS as part of this tutorial, I'm going to be doing some copying and pasting, but we're at least going to know what we're doing when we're doing that copying and pasting. So our first goal is we're going to try to understand what TLS actually is. We want to know what we're doing when we're putting an HTTPS site out in the world. Then we're going to work on acquiring a certificate. And luckily for all of us, I got my beta invite for Let's Encrypt last night, and we got it all working, so I'll give you a demonstration of Let's Encrypt. We'll talk about what exactly that is, but if you've heard of it before, it's pretty awesome. We're going to acquire a certificate so that we're actually connecting a real live HTTPS site today. And then finally, we're going to do all of the steps of configuring TLS. We're going to go from a default configuration that's really quite terrible to an A+ configuration that is very, very strong and something that hopefully you can use to kind of model your own TLS configurations after. How's that sound? Good? It's a great thing to do on a Tuesday morning, right? TLS, make the world a little bit more secure? I like it. Okay, well, I want to give you a quick note on TLS and SSL. I'm going to be using both of these terms throughout the talk today, but I want you to kind of know that I'm using them synonymously. Just to give you some technical background on that, SSL was the original term, Secure Sockets Layer. It was developed by Netscape Navigator initially, and then Microsoft Internet Explorer got interested in like, hey, we kind of want this as well. So they wanted to put it on a standards track. But because those browser war days in the late 90s were pretty ugly, there's no way that Internet Explorer would allow SSL, a product of Netscape Navigator, to become the standard. So it went through a name change. They called it TLS, or Transport Layer Security. So TLS was the first standards track version of this secure protocol, and it was implemented in 1999. There are some differences between SSL and TLS, but it's essentially could be thought of as TLS version 1 being SSL version 4. It's just the next in the series of the TLS versions. Other thing I kind of want to point out here with TLS is look how old this stuff is. Right, earlier this year, there was a pretty critical vulnerability found in SSL version 3, and so recommendation was to deprecate that. Like Nginx, for instance, they went ahead and took that away from their default configuration. That was something that was built in 1996. Like, that's crazy. And so now we're saying, okay, well, as long as you're using TLS version 1, which is built in 1999, right? Party like it's 1999 with TLS version 1. Like, that's crazy, right? So this stuff is really, really old. TLS version 1.2, which is the state of the art at this point, was built in 2008. What was the version of PHP we were rocking in 2008? Is that 5.3? 5.4? Right, this stuff is old. Hopefully we're looking at TLS version 1.3 coming in the next year or so, but it seems like talks on that are kind of all over the place and there's not a clear path forward. So when I say TLS, SSL, I'm going to be using those kind of interchangeably. Sometimes, like, it sounds a little bit weird to say TLS certificate. SSL certificates, it's just kind of, it's what's in the zeitgeist. So just realize when I'm talking about those, I'm using them synonymously. So the big thing we're going to be talking today about are the 4 kind of pillars of TLS. And this is authentication, integrity, encryption, and key exchange. These are the 4 things that TLS provides for you. I want you to have these down by memory by the time we're done today. Authentication, integrity, encryption, and key exchange. If you have all 4 of these things and you're doing them all properly with the right algorithms, you can perform a secure TLS connection. So let's dive into each of these in great detail. Authentication. This is what we usually think about when we think about HTTPS. We know that there's some sort of certificate involved, and that there needs to be some sort of certificate validation process to validate that the entity we're talking to is the entity we intend to talk to. This is really concerned with the idea is the server the intended server? When we go to google.com, are we actually communicating with google.com, or are we communicating with G00GLE.com? We do this through a chain of trust that is established via certificates. How many people here have gone out and gotten a TLS certificate before, or SSL certificate? Okay, yeah, so you go through this process to go get a certificate. There's some sort of validation that you own that domain. Maybe you prove this by adding some DNS records, or maybe you prove this by putting a file on your server, or you respond to an email that's associated with that particular domain. Once you do that, you're going to be issued a certificate, and through a chain of trust, your certificate can be validated by a browser, by a curl client, by maybe some sort of Java client, and PHP. This would be through like your pull requests. This would be validated that, yes, there is some authenticity to the certificate. And the way this works is that you're issued this end certificate. This is what you install on your server. We're going to be doing this today. And in this end certificate, it has a lot of different pieces of information. One, it'll have your domain. So it actually expresses, what domain is this valid for? It'll give you the signing algorithm that was used to sign that certificate. It'll actually provide a signature so that a certificate that will be authenticating this certificate knows the signature and it knows the signing algorithm, allowing them to produce that same signature. And then also embedded in your certificate is a public key and a public exponent. These are values that allow you to perform asymmetric encryption for being able to pass values back between the server and the client. So it holds all of this information. What I want to focus on right now is the domain, the signing algorithm, and the signature. So this is your end certificate that you put on your server. This certificate is actually signed then by an intermediate certificate. This is a certificate that a certificate authority has been issued. They are a certificate authority in that they have been authorized to be able to sign other end certificates, giving them trust, basically saying that this certificate authority, they've gone through some process to say that we trust this end user. We've validated their domain. If you got an extra validation certificate, we've gone through the process of actually calling the person, talking to them, asking them questions to validate that that person is who that person says they are. And then they've signed that certificate. So they're saying that we have the certificate that other browsers trust, and we say we trust this end leaf by signing that certificate. Then we have a root certificate. These root certificates are in your browser. They might be installed on your system so curl can access it. Any sort of client that you're using to make HTTPS connections is going to have a store of these root browsers. These are sort of universally trusted certificates that are used to sign your intermediate certificates. What ends up happening is you have a chain of trust that looks like this. Your root certificate that is distributed with, say, a browser, it has signed an intermediate certificate for a certificate authority, basically saying that we trust the decisions made by this certificate authority, right? And then the certificate authority, they take their certificate and use that to sign the end certificate that the user would get when they go through issuing a certificate from a certificate authority. That certificate trusts your end certificate, leading to this full chain of trust. This transfer of trust idea is something that we as human beings know pretty well. What if you're having a gathering over at your house, some party, whatever, and you ask a friend, like, hey, can you come over that night? And they're like, oh yeah, but I was going to do something with my friend Joe. Can I bring Joe over as well? You don't know Joe. Do you let strangers into your house usually? Like if someone just on the street is like, hey, can I just come in? Like hang out? You probably don't do that. But since Joe knows your friend, you trust your friend's judgment of other people, you're most likely going to say yes. There's a transfer of trust there. That's essentially what's happening here. Your root trusts the certificate authority can then transfer its trust to the end certificate, leading to this full transfer of trust, being able to then verify a certificate for an end user. Does that make sense? Yeah, the question was, is there sometimes more than one level? Absolutely. So there can be multiple certificates. And these multiple certificates can come up for a variety of reasons. One can be that there's cross-signing done. So a new certificate authority, it can be signed by another certificate authority, and there can be a chain of trust that goes through multiple certificate authorities. So you would go from end to intermediate to root. And technically, from a TLS perspective, these chains can go forever. They really can go forever. You don't want to do that because there's a lot of performance implications, and then you're kind of getting into some weird trust situations. But yes, you can have multiple certificates. And I've typically, before Let's Encrypt, I used Rapid SSL, and they are signed by GeoTrust. So with Rapid SSL, I usually have an N certificate, a Rapid SSL certificate, a GeoTrust, and then a root. So it's 4 levels deep. I don't think I've ever actually seen more than 4 levels deep from a popular CA. I'm sure there's some use case for that. Any other questions? Also, feel free to ask questions as we go along. I don't want to rush through this. We have a lot of time, so let me know if you have any questions. Okay, so that's authentication. The other thing TLS provides us is integrity. Not only do we want to make sure that the data we're receiving is from the entity we hoped we're receiving it from, but we want to make sure that that data doesn't change in the process of receiving it. So what we're asking with the integrity question is the message received the message that is sent? When Google gives us that response back, has someone tampered with it in the process, and now we are responding to a tampered message? We hope that that's not the case. TLS can provide this integrity for us. Let me show you how this happens. So let's imagine Google is just sending us some data back. They're giving us that HTTP response back. We would start with essentially parallel process. We have both our raw data, and then we're going to do something else with our other data. What we're first going to do is, if we take our raw data on this side over here, we're going to go ahead and encrypt that. So that data can't be sniffed in the process. Like nobody, if they saw the data, they don't know what that data actually is. It's just some ciphertext that they cannot decipher. But then we take that same data, and we're going to run it through a hashing algorithm. So that we're creating a fingerprint for this data, creating a signature, however you want to think about it. It's going to be some representation of this data that identifies that data. Then we're going to take that hash, and we're going to encrypt that hash as well. So then what we're actually going to send to the receiver, we're going to send back to the browser, is we're going to send them 2 forms of this data. We're going to send them the encrypted data, which is just the regular data that's gone through some sort of cipher to change that to ciphertext. Then we're going to send them another form of the data that has been hashed, so it's a fingerprint of the data, and then that fingerprint has been encrypted, where we send both of those on to the receiver. Just to be absolutely clear here, the receiver now has both the encrypted hash and the encrypted data. So they receive the E hash, the encrypted hash, and the E data, the encrypted data. What they're going to do with this is they are going to decrypt both of these. We're just going to assume that they have the ability to do that because they do. They're going to decrypt both of them, meaning they now have a plain text hash and a plain text data. What they do with the data is then they use the same hashing algorithm to hash that data. Can anybody predict what happens next? Yeah, they make sure that's the same data. So they will compare the hashes, right? What they've done is they've gotten the data, they've decrypted it, and then they went ahead and hashed that. So they provided the fingerprint for that data. They also got that hash that has been encrypted, and they've decrypted that data. They got that hash, and now they compare the hash that they were just given from, the hash that they were given from the sender and the hash that they computed themselves. If those two things equal each other, that data has integrity. That data has not been tampered with in transit. Did you have a question? Does the hash and the data always use the same cipher? So you're usually going to have a hashing algorithm, something like SHA-256. Yeah, so they'll use like SHA-256, and then they will encrypt it with a different cipher. So in this case, you're probably going to use like RSA to actually encrypt the data, and then you'll send that across. Or, sorry, you might use AES. I apologize. So you would take the data, you would hash it with something like SHA-256, and then you would encrypt it with AES. Yes, that would match the encryption on the content. Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, can you say that again? It can be either one. So are they hashes or HMACs? So essentially it is an HMAC when it comes down to it, because it will be an encrypted hash. Different cipher suites can be configured to use different types of hashing algorithms. Right now, it's not popular to use HMAX just because they're not widely supported. So what you're going to do is you're going to use the hash then encrypt. There's movements towards using more of HMAX in the future, but it's just not widely supported. Other questions about integrity? So this is how we validate that the data has not been tampered with. We use this process to make sure we have the same fingerprints on both sides of the transaction. Now we move into encryption. Encryption, I think, gets a little bit fun. So we probably all have just a general sense of what encryption is. I want to make sure we're on the same page with this, though. Encryption converts plain text to ciphertext. It moves something that is intelligible, something that we can understand because we can read or we can understand numbers, to something that is just kind of garbled up, nothing that we can't understand. As an example, here is some ciphertext. Can anybody crack this? I think I heard it. PHP world. Yeah. So this is really bad ciphertext, right? A human computer just deciphered this, and I think that was about 4 seconds. Maybe it was even faster because you knew it before you said it. But this is really bad ciphertext, but this is a good example for us. This is just a representation of the word PHP world using a very simple algorithm that nobody should be using in their TLS. Just to be clear, I'm not advocating for this. This is a teaching example only. This is what we're using here is a substitution cipher. Does anybody know the specific name of this substitution cipher? It's ROT13, yeah. If you're familiar with ROT13, all you do is you take a letter, you move it 13 letters down the alphabet, and you have your new letter. Each letter has a corresponding representation in its ciphertext. So an A would become N, a B becomes O, C becomes P, so on and so forth. It's a very simple algorithm here. And if we want to express it with some math symbols, it looks like you take your letter, you move it 13 values, and you get a cipher letter. And this is what is known as a substitution cipher. It is also classified as a Caesar cipher. Caesar himself was said to use this with a key, essentially, of 3. So he would move the letters 3 down the alphabet. And this was pretty strong security, apparently, in his times. Actual sources on that are hard to find, but this is apparently what he used. This is not something that we would ever use, right? The reason I bring this up is I want to illustrate the purpose of a key. A key in this case is a value that we apply to an encryption algorithm that allows us to change plain text to ciphertext. So in this case, our key is 13, right? We have a substitution cipher where we know we move a letter X letters down the alphabet, and then we get our new letter, our new encoded, encrypted letter. The strength of this, the strength of our encryption usually is in the key. In this case, we have a very weak algorithm, so there is really no strength there. I just want to emphasize the fact that we have a key, we apply this to an algorithm, and that allows us to change plain text into ciphertext. If the person who encodes this message has this key, and the person who is decoding it also has the key, the decryption becomes really easy for them. They just apply the same algorithm kind of in reverse using the key, and they can take ciphertext and turn it into plain text. I'm emphasizing this again. This is a weak cipher. Please don't use this. Don't use this. Don't use this. Don't use this. Don't blame it on me if you do use it, okay? The problem here is that we've learned over time that we shouldn't be placing the secrecy of our encryption in an algorithm. If you look at kind of the history of the cat and mouse game between cryptographers and cryptanalysts, people that try to break these ciphers, a lot of times they were placing a lot of emphasis on making an algorithm that nobody else could figure out. And you keep that algorithm really safe. You don't let anybody else see that. And if they figure out the algorithm, then they have the key to unlock everything. Over time, what cryptographers realized is that was actually a really bad policy. The problem is that you're going to develop these algorithms that have some weaknesses. And rather than you developing that algorithm and keeping it safe and not allowing people to find those weaknesses, you are potentially putting algorithms out there in the world that have those weaknesses and are giving people easy ways to break them. So the policy has changed over time. They've essentially wanted to move towards more open source cryptography where their algorithms are out there in the world and anybody can see them and evaluate them. They want people attacking these algorithms. The advantage is that if people have attacked these for years and years and years and they're not finding easy ways to decrypt them, then we know we have an encryption scheme that will work for a lot of different situations. It can protect a lot of data for us, and we can with some certainty say this is a good encryption scheme for you to use. And instead of putting the secrecy in the algorithm, we put the secrecy in the key. So a good encryption cipher will have emphasis on using big keys. You apply the key to the algorithm that allows you to turn the plain text into the ciphertext. And as long as you keep your key secret, you don't let anybody have your password, for instance, you should be able to have good security around that data that's encrypted with that algorithm and the key. The cipher that we tend to use nowadays is known as the Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES. It's actually the Rindale encryption scheme. There's basically a big contest to see who could produce the best algorithm, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology determined that the best one here, the winner, I'm sure there's all sorts of politics behind this, but they decided that AES was the best. It allowed developers, allowed everyone to do the work that we do, work that systems people do, cryptographers, to really standardize around AES. So if one application, one piece of software encrypts something using AES, another piece of software should be able to decrypt it. This is kind of work towards standards so that we can have software that can work together. And basically all it does is it has many rounds of substitution, many rounds of permutations to garble up all of this data. So the important piece that I want you to realize here with a good algorithm for encryption, it's well known, it's well understood, it's been attacked, and people have sort of certified it. We want to put this work off onto cryptographers, like PhD level cryptographers who are evaluating this stuff, and then we as software developers can implement this in our software. We use that good algorithm plus a good key that we handle very securely can allow us to have good security in terms of turning plain text into ciphertext and decrypting our ciphertext back to our plain text. Any questions about that? We're going to move on to our last kind of pillar of TLS. All right, this one gets a lot of fun. I really like to talk about key exchange. So what we've essentially said is that we can pass around encrypted content if we have a good algorithm and a good key. So we can encrypt our plain text into our ciphertext, and then I can pass this message out into the world, out to you all out here. How in the world are you going to decrypt that? What do you need to decrypt that? A key, right? You're going to need to know that key. So, wait, what? So how do we establish an encryption key for two unknown parties over an insecure connection? Like right now, if I want to exchange an encrypted message with someone out here that I've never met before, like, do I like walk down there and I like write on a piece of paper, like, here's the key. And then I'm going to send you a message now that I walk back up here. Like that's just impractical, right? Especially for the modern web. Well, this is what actually used to happen. Back in the day, in World War II, the Germans came up with what was thought to be one of the best encryption schemes, the Enigma machine. And this operated on the fact that they had to distribute keys out to everyone who would be encrypting and decrypting messages. This is a really bad picture, I apologize, for one of their books that contained these keys. It was based on the day and the month. They would, at least the reading I've done, suggested that they would distribute these keys for a full month. So they'd have some courier walking around handing out these keys to different people that would be doing this encryption and decryption. And what it would tell them is on, November 17th, is that where we're at? 18th, they would use this particular key. The people who were doing the encryption would use this key. The people that were doing the decryption would use this key, and they would use that key for a full day. Well, the reason that this scheme ended up breaking was that the British intelligence, which you probably saw portrayed very well by Benedict Cumberbatch in the movie Intimidation Game, very well, just showed that he built a machine that could break this encryption. They could get the key for the day, and they know that they would use that for the next 24 hours because they did some kind of silly things in how they encrypted stuff, but they were able to break that and then use that to decrypt stuff for the next 24 hours. They were just delivering these keys daily. And so if we need to, in our modern web, be able to exchange these keys to be able to do, secure connections, it's like if we have Jeff Bezos, when I'm placing an order on Amazon, comes to my house and he's like, here you go, here's your key, enjoy placing your order. We'll have it to you in the next 13 hours because we're ridiculous magicians that do crazy stuff like that. This doesn't work for the modern web. That's the point. This does not work for the modern web. We need something else. And fortunately, some smart people have solved this problem for us. And we have what is now known as the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. I like to call it the Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange because Merkle really got the shaft here. He's really not credited ever for this, but he was part of the team that discovered how to do this key exchange. What a key exchange does is it allows us to communicate insecure values. It allows us to communicate values over an insecure channel, leaving us with secure keys by the time that's done. So we can have communications between two parties out in the open, and by the time that we're done with that communication, those two entities, and only those two entities, will have the key. And then they can use that key for encryption and decryption. This is a little hard to wrap your head around, so I'd like to do a demo to show this. Can I have 2 volunteers? I'm not going to ask you to do anything hard. Yeah, come on up. Since you said first, do you want to be Alice or Bob? Bob, okay. Why don't you come on up? We need an Alice. Alice, come on up. So Bob, hand this to you. Actually, I'll just have you come over here. Oop. Knock down the luggage in the process. Alice, here you go. All right. So I just want to ask everybody, can you see these numbers? P equals what? G equals? Okay, so 2 people can see them. I don't know if I need to make the font bigger. I just want to acknowledge that these values are public knowledge. We all know this. So I'm going to have Alice and Bob perform a key exchange in front of you all here, okay? So I want you to listen as they speak things out, and then they also are going to keep some things secret. So Alice and Bob, can you do step number 1? Okay. Great. And then can you do step number 2? Great. And step number 2? Just go ahead and circle the whole row. Just make sure we're doing good. Great. Okay, Bob, what I'm going to have you do is step number 3. And then I'm going to have you announce that out. And Alice, I'm going to have you record this number. Recorded that? Okay, so I'm going to have you do step number 3 and then announce that out. Yep, and announce that out.
Do it.
You're going to record that? So everyone heard that? Bob said 16. Alice said 20. Okay, sorry, it was quiet. All right, so now let's move on to step 6. Both of you. Okay, and then can you complete the final step? Write really big. Be dramatic about this. Yep, write that really big. Okay, here's the moment of truth. Is everyone ready for this? Can you show everyone your numbers? Right, that's huge. That was, that was exciting. Thank you, Alice and Bob. That was fantastic. I was too. I was more scared than you, I promise. Okay, so what we saw is we had 2 people announce some numbers publicly. All of you, men and women in the middle, could have attacked that number, right? You all saw that number. Did anyone know that the resulting key was 6? And if you did, you're lying, or you're just good at guessing, right? So you didn't know that. What you had was you heard them say 23. You heard them say 5. You heard Bob announce 16, I believe, and then Alice announce 20, right? Let's break this down exactly how that information led to us getting to the final number. So we're going to take a look at, we're going to do some math now. This is where things get hard, okay? Oops. Let me put this over where you can see it. Okay, perfect. Everyone see that okay? So what we had happen, I got to find these numbers. We had Alice pick a number 5, and Bob picked number 8. Okay? So initially, we had announced P and G. These are values that are available in your public key. So these are numbers that anybody can see just by downloading your public key. They are going to be gargantuan. They're going to be huge, huge numbers. In this case, we're keeping them small to make them very easy. We have a prime number, P, which is our prime, 23, and we have a generator, G, which is just 5 in this case. The most important thing is that the prime number needs to be prime. What I asked Alice and Bob to do on those sheets was they needed to pick a number that they were going to keep secret to themselves. No one heard them announce 5 or 8. Those are the numbers that they chose. What they did announce, though, was a number that could publicly be heard. So what Alice did is she took her number, 5, so she did G, which is 5, raised it to the 5th, and then mod P, it's modular arithmetic, it's basically getting the remainder of the value. I'm not going to go into that, but what that gave us at the end was 20. And then she announced 20. We all heard 20, right? We all heard 20. Bob did the same thing. He took his number, did G raised to B, so 5 raised to 8, mod 23, and got 16. He announced that number out. Then each of them took that individual number. So Bob took the A, the capital A, which was 20, raised it to his secret number, which was 8, mod 23, and got 6. Alice did the same thing. She took Bob's number that he announced, raised it to A, and did mod 23, and also got 6. They arrived at the same key just by announcing these numbers publicly. Now, the secrecy here is in their A and B values. If you crack A or B, you can get that value. They never announce that. They just run it through these functions that allow them to get access to that information. So ultimately, what they end up with is keys that they can use for encryption and decryption that they both have. So they can both take that key, apply it to their algorithm, AES usually, and then that'll allow them to encrypt data and the other person to be able to decrypt that. So I hope I'm doing a good enough job to explain this that some minds are blown here, because this is incredible what this advance allows us to do. It's a huge problem being able to get keys out to unknown entities in the world. And we have to do this before we have secure communications, right? When we establish our TLS connection, we don't have a secure connection. So how do we securely exchange things before we have a secure connection, right? It's a huge paradox. This is some really smart math that allows us to do this. So let me slip back to my slides here. What they get in the end is an S value. And in TLS terms, S is what is known as a pre-master secret, which then has a little bit more randomness added to it, primarily to make sure that we have a key of sufficient size to be able to derive the master secret. And that master secret is used for encryption. The reason that this works for us is that we rely on properties of some trapdoor functions. A trapdoor function in mathematics is a function that is easy to do one way. So we saw how easy this was, right? You're just taking a number, raising it to a number, and doing mod whatever the other number was. This is really easy. Like a calculator can do this in no time. You saw that awesome Solver app like rock that mathematics when I just typed that number in, did it instantly, we didn't have to wait. It's pretty awesome. The catch here is it's pretty much impossible to do it the other way. So if you have 6, and then I give you 23, and I give you 5, and I also give you those other numbers, can you figure out what those secret numbers are? With small numbers, that's actually quite doable, but with bigger numbers, that is really difficult. Basically, we get to the point where if you take all the computer power of the world, take 100 years, you can't still figure out what that number is. Yes, sir. Oh. The solver thing, where all the math? How about, can we do it at break? Yeah. I have to get out of my slides and everything, so. Okay. So, here we were. So it's impossible to do it the other way. We're relying on the fact that we know for someone to crack this, they need extreme computing power, the kind that theoretically we don't think exists in this world. So that's why we're okay announcing those numbers publicly. We know someone can't crack that. Now, what's really important here is that looking at that algorithm that I showed you, if any of these values change, if Alice or Bob, if they chose a different number initially, or if we change G or P, we know that S will be a different number. And S in this case leads to our encryption key. We want to have different encryption keys as frequently as possible. Now let's think if we had a key exchange scenario where every time we did this key exchange, let's say I'm the server, you're the client, you're doing a key exchange with me, and we end up with the encryption key 6. Then I go to someone else, we end up with the encryption key 6. Then I go to someone else, we end up with the encryption key 6. And another person, encryption key 6. What's the problem there? The encryption key is 6, and we hate the number 6. No. So it's always 6, right? Why might that be a problem? What happens when someone figures out the number 6? What happens when someone says, I know the encryption key. I just cracked the connection between this server and one person here. They now know that that's 6. What problem does that present for us? They can use that for previous transactions and what else? Just more specifically. Decrypt the other connections as well. So if we're always leading to the same key, if this server will only ever use this one key for encryption, we're in a real bind. We now have like all this communication out there that's using the same key for encryption, and they just broke our connection. They can use that then to decrypt all of the other connections. This is the principle that leads us to wanting forward secrecy. If we make sure we change up some of these numbers for every single connection, we're always going to get a different S, meaning that our encryption key is 6, but this one over here is 8, this one over here is 9. We have different encryption keys, so if this is cracked, if this connection is cracked, the other connections are still secure. So essentially what this means is that A or B would change. G and P are embedded in our certificate, so those are not going to change. We just need to generate a new A or B for this transaction. This is the principle of forward secrecy. If you've heard of this term before, this is exactly what we're talking about. We essentially are setting up our key exchange so that we ensure at the end of the key exchange we're always producing unique encryption keys so that an individual session will be protected by a different encryption key than another session. So that if some powerful adversary gets a hold of that key, they only have access to that one session, not all of these sessions. People heard of LavaBit? Anybody familiar with LavaBit? This is an email service that is now defunct that gained some popularity around the time of the Snowden revelations because Edward Snowden had an account with LavaBit. Now LavaBit billed themselves as secure email, Everything is encrypted on our servers. Everything is encrypted between your browser and the server. Well, it turned out that when authorities were trying to track down Snowden, they found out that he had an account at LavaBit. Interestingly enough, there was some issues with how the TLS had been set up. So the storage of all the data on the servers was really secure. The developer did a really great job with this. But in terms of the TLS, there were some issues. From the developer himself, Ladar Levison, he said, I failed to update the LavaBit SSL configuration to prefer ciphers that provided perfect forward secrecy. What does this statement mean for being able to get at Edward Snowden's emails? This means that they just had to get the one key and they could decrypt his email. They could decrypt everybody else's email who is establishing a secure connection between the browser and the server. And what's really interesting in this case is that Ladar was sued. He was compelled to hand over this key. He fought it really hard. It's a really interesting case you should read about. I think is really neat. And he wrote all about his experiences. Basically what it came down to is that he was compelled to eventually give up the key that allowed them to generate the encryption keys and presumably be able to decrypt these communications. He then, 3 days later after he gave up the key, shut the whole business down because he felt like doing that undermined his whole business. We're going to hear some more from him later, but one of the important things about this is that perfect forward secrecy could help you in situations where your communications might be of interest to people and you want to make sure they're nice and secure. Making sure that you secure every communication with a different key is essential. So we're about 50 minutes in right now. We're going to turn our attention to cipher suites that we're done with, now that we're done with understanding these four main pillars. But before we do that, I want to give everybody a chance to take a little break. If you need to run to the bathroom, let's just reconvene here at 10 o'clock and we'll get going again. Does that sound good? All right, feel free to go, or stay, have some coffee.
Something's out there in space that regulations don't cover. Ladies and gentlemen, Station MXA. The regulations don't cover. MXA calling. X.
started again. I missed the fifth pillar of TLS, and that's caffeine, but it looks like everyone has filled that in, so good on you for catching me on that one. So I just want to do kind of a checkpoint here. We've talked about the 4 parts of TLS: authentication, integrity, encryption, and key exchange. Does anybody have questions about that before we move on? I just want to make sure we're all good. We can go way deeper in those topics, but in a 3-hour session, this is, I think, a good level of depth to understand what this is, to be able to understand then how to use this in our configurations. Okay, cool. Well, again, questions, just let me know. This is, more informal than like a normal presentation, so I'm happy to answer any questions if people don't understand things as we go along. So we now know those 4 pillars. I'm going to say it again for emphasis: authentication, integrity, encryption, and key exchange. All right, so we configure this in basically all software that we're going to use with cipher suites. A cipher suite allows us to communicate to a piece of software what we want to use to define all 4 of those different pillars. So really, it's just a combination of algorithms for authentication, integrity, encryption, and key exchange. If this was an actual class, there would be a pop quiz later, and the first thing I would ask you are, what are those 4 things? Authentication, integrity, encryption, and key exchange. So it's important to understand cipher suites because this is by far the most confusing thing that you're going to encounter when you're configuring TLS. A cipher suite looks like this. And I think the irony of this is it looks like this is encrypted text, but this is actually supposedly meaningful text that you should be able to understand what this is saying, right? Everyone knows what this means. We can just move on, right? No, like this is really difficult. So the joke here, if I was really trying to be funny, I'd say you'd first have to decrypt this to understand what this is doing for your encryption, right? No? Yeah, okay. So that's why I don't actually use that joke. So anyhow, what these cipher suites will do is they will be explaining all 4 of those main areas for us. Let's break this particular cipher suite down. This cipher suite is a common one that across the internet for well-configured TLS sites. This first bit describes our key exchange. That was the last thing we did before the break. And what this is saying is we want to use the ephemeral, elliptic curve, Diffie-Hellman key exchange. What we did was a version of a Diffie-Hellman key exchange. It was not the elliptic curve version. Elliptic curve math gets really complicated, and it's well beyond my abilities because I do not possess a PhD in math. So what we would do here is we're going to do the Diffie-Hellman exchange, and the Diffie-Hellman exchange basically uses those one-way functions like we saw used in the demo to announce some values but allow the secret to only be derived by the 2 entities that are communicating, and it's going to use elliptic curve cryptography. The main point you should realize about elliptic curve cryptography, it's one of these rare birds where you get better security and better performance by using elliptic curve cryptography. Basically, the algorithm is much stronger, and so you can use smaller keys in this encryption, and with the use of smaller keys, you have to put fewer bytes on the wire. It makes it a lot faster. And the algorithm is much faster itself. So this first part explains our key exchange. The second part explains our authentication mechanism. We're going to use the RSA algorithm for signing our certificates. Now this bit is determined by the certificate that you get. The default is RSA. Most CAs are going to give you an RSA certificate if you don't specify otherwise. The other one that you might see people use is known as ECDSA, which is also based on elliptic curve cryptography. It's elliptic curve digital signing algorithm. It's going to be popular in the future, but right now RSA is going to be the algorithm that most clients will be supporting. Then we're going to specify our cipher. This is what we use to encrypt plain text into ciphertext. In this case, we're going to use the Advanced Encryption Standard 128 in GCM mode. So this means that we're using AES with a 128-bit key, and then we're using the special mode for processing called the GCM mode. And finally, we're going to specify our message authentication code for our integrity. This is what we use to hash the data when we send it on the wire so that we can prove that the data has not been altered in transport. So that's a little bit more palatable now. We know those 4 concepts, and all of these values are just relating to those different concepts. When you actually put cipher suites in your configuration, it's going to look like this. This is when everyone crosses their eyes and they just copy and paste and they're like, YOLO, we'll just hope this goes well, right? This is hard to process. I'll take some time to kind of break down what's actually going on here. What we're doing is we're specifying a list of potential cipher suites that we're okay using in our TLS configuration. If our server is configured correctly, we're going to first prefer the very first cipher suite that we list. This is the one that we just broke down. But if that one doesn't work with the client that's connecting to our server, we're going to fall back to the next one. If that doesn't work, we'll fall back to the next one. We try to find a compatible cipher suite for the client that is connecting to the server. And what we're saying is we prefer this ordering. We're preferring the ciphers, the key exchanges, the authentication codes, the MAC codes that have the best security properties first, and then we're falling back to things that we're like, we'll accept this, but this isn't ideal. So this allows us to have backwards compatibility with a sort of graceful degradation. We're all familiar with graceful degradation. We use this when we develop for the Internet Explorer browsers, right? This is the same concept, and guess what? We're also doing graceful degradation for Internet Explorer browsers. So we want to make sure that we find a compatible suite that will allow us to, will allow other browsers to connect to our server. So we're expressing a lot of cipher suites, but then we can also specify other things like never use RC4 encryption. It's known to have critical vulnerabilities, so we never want to use that. We would never want to use MD5 for our integrity hashes because those collisions, hash collisions are possible with MD5 nowadays. So that's what some of this not expression down here is telling us. Never use these types of algorithms. You probably have seen this information displayed before if you've ever looked at the lock icon in a site that accepts a secure connection. This is my personal website in Chrome. If you click the green icon, you're going to get this panel of information. If we zoom in a little bit, we'll start to see a little bit about what we're doing. We know that we're using TLS version 1.2. That's because my server is configured to handle that, and that's because Chrome can handle it. But then we get down here and it says the connection is encrypted and authenticated using AES 128 GCM. That's what I specified for the cipher suite, so we know that encryption is AES. We know at this point that we're not using something like RC4, so that this communication that likely can't be cracked. And it's using ECDHE, so the ephemeral elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And then I've always kind of taken issue with exactly how they describe this. They're saying ECDHE RSA as a key exchange mechanism, but really RSA is for authenticating, for signing our certificates, and ECDHE is for key exchange. And for whatever reason, they have no information about the data integrity. So that's what this means. I'm hoping that maybe at least one person, this was news to you and that you've learned something, you kind of start to understand exactly what this means. So these are cipher suites. Cipher suites are the trickiest part of configuring TLS. We're going to deal with this in the last portion of this tutorial when we actually configure a server for TLS. And we'll kind of copy from some reliable sources on what to use. But right now what we're going to talk about is the TLS handshake. When you establish a connection with a remote site from a client, you initially establish a TCP connection. You send some information from the client to the browser, or sorry, from the client to the server sends some information back, they make sure everything's synced up, and now you can start communicating. Normally at that point, with an HTTP website, you would start communicating HTTP requests and receive responses back from the server. But in the land of TLS, not only do we need to initially do a TCP connection, but we then need to engage in a TLS handshake. So we do an initial connection. That means we've kind of opened up this pipeline to be able to talk between the client and the server, and then we engage in a TLS connection. And it looks a little like this. It's going to be initialized by the client. It's going to do what's known as a client hello message, sends that information over to the server. The server responds with its own server hello message. responds with a certificate, server hello done, comes over to the client, we do the client key exchange, the change cipher spec, and the finished message, and then we do a change cipher spec on the server and a finished message, and then we can start sending application data. We need to go deeper into this to understand what all of this junk means. Main point I'm showing here is this is the overall view of this connection. A standard TLS connection requires 1, 2 round trips between the client and the server. That's on top of the TCP connection that already requires 1 round trip. So by the time you've established a TLS connection, you've done 3 round trips between the client and server. There's some advancements made to this handshake that have reduced it down to just 2 total between TCP and TLS, but the full handshake looks like this. So we're going to go through each one of these individually. And I will provide slides at the end of all of this, so I know if you're hurriedly writing things down, I will have slides for you at the end. So the client to server communication starts with a client hello. And this is really cool what it does. It basically says, hello server, I would like to engage in a TLS communication with you. Here are the cipher suites that I will support. I can understand communications if we use this list of cipher suites. Usually what you'll see is a browser presenting a list of a dozen or so cipher suites, whatever it can handle. It also will say, here's the TLS version that I can handle. And then it also provides some random values that are used for converting the pre-master secret into the master secret, which isn't super important to understand, but basically adds some more values in there to help you generate your encryption key. So the important part of the initial client hello is, here are the cipher suites I can use, and here's the TLS version that I can use. The server responds by choosing which cipher suite the server would like to use, saying, okay, I understand that you can work with all these different cipher suites. I know that this one is the best of all of those, so that's the one I want to use. So the server will pick that for you. It also chooses the TLS version that it can support, and it's obviously going to prefer the best TLS connection possible. That's what the server says in its initial hello message. The server also, in this communication, begins its certificate communication. And what it does is it sends the full certificate chain, and then it sends the it sends the algorithm that was used for that certificate. So what it's going to do, if you configure your server correctly, is it sends your end certificate and the intermediate certificate. Basically, you're going to send everything except the root certificate, because the root certificate is available in the browser itself. And even if you send it the root certificate, the browser will ignore it, because if you're sending it a root certificate, who's to say that you haven't tampered with that and given them an invalid root certificate? So that's an important part. I'll emphasize that later on when we're configuring it. But you want to send the end certificate and all of the intermediate certificates, but not the root certificate. It's ignored, and it basically causes you a performance penalty, because early in those communications, you're sending data that is just not used. And then you also send it the certificate, the algorithm that you're using for signing the certificate. In this case, you're just basically going to be saying RSA. We're using RSA for signing the certificate. That should match the cipher suite choice. So earlier we saw that cipher suite that had RSA in it. We need to, the server will send the information saying that here's the certs, and this is what we've used to sign the certs. Then we do the server key exchange message. All we're doing here is we're sending the info we need for the key exchange. This we should understand really well. We did this demo. So this is the equivalent of Alice or Bob, whatever one you want to consider the server, announcing that data. That's what's happening right here. The server announces that number that is used for the key exchange. That's what happens here. Now steps 2, 3, and 4 have all been server to client. All 3 of these things are packaged up and they're sent as in one trip. This isn't like 3 separate communications. They all go together, but they're just blocked out so we can understand them a little bit better. Oh, and then there's one other thing. There's a server hello message, server hello done message that basically says, I'm done sending you everything you need for my initial my initial trip. We're done here. Now we need some more information from you. Just communicating to the client that the server needs to do nothing else at that point. The client then will respond with its information for the key exchange. So this is like, Bob now responding with his key exchange information. At this point, the client actually has enough information because they have the key exchange information from the server. It can compute the final master secret that it's going to use, but has enough information for encryption. So it can start sending encrypted messages. So it does that at this point. It basically says we're going to change cipher spec. We're now going from insecure mode to secure mode. I can switch to encryption. I know all the values I need to. I have the algorithm. I have the master secret. Now I'm going to start using encryption. And then it sends a finished message, basically saying that my part of all of this is completely done. The server then does the same thing. It changes to the cipher spec. So it has the key exchange information it needs because it has a master key. It has the encryption algorithm, and then it will send that. It will start communicating using ciphertext, and then it finally sends its finished message. That was a crash course, right? Any questions on this? What I want to emphasize here is not so much knowing every detail about the handshake, but I want to kind of contextualize what we're doing when we're configuring TLS. All of these different messages are going to contain different values depending on how we configure our server to do TLS. So depending on how we configure our key exchange, we're going to be exchanging different data during the key exchange message. How we configure our ciphertext, our cipher algorithm depends on how we're going to be changing to our encryption. Is all of that kind of like sinking in a little bit? Can understand how those ciphers then relate to our handshake, which also relate to those 4 principles? Okay, I'll keep moving on then. We're going to get into, I think, what are a lot easier concepts now, and hopefully this will be stuff that people have heard of. I'm really hoping. HTTP strict transport security. Before this talk, who's heard of this? I'm always curious to see if this is in the public zeitgeist yet. Okay, so a few people. HTTP strict transport security is a mechanism that allows us to avoid a specific type of man-in-the-middle attack aimed at TLS. When you're done with this talk and you've gone and watched everybody else's tutorials, you're going to go get my slides, and you should go to this URL. It's thoughtcrime.org/software/SSL strip. You're going to want to watch this right now, but please don't, just out of respect. It'd be nice. There's a fantastic video by a gentleman named Moxie Marlinspike. At the time, I think he worked more on white hat security, but he was presenting at a black hat security conference in 2009, and he was for the first time demonstrating this SSL stripping attack. Now, what SSL stripping does is it preys on sites that like to have mixed HTTP and HTTPS versions of sites. This used to be the commonplace thing, right? You'd go to your banking website, and all their marketing material would be on HTTP. You'd kind of go around, look at all those nice loans that you can get and all that fun stuff, and then you're like, you know what, I want to log into my account. So you push the login button, and what does that do? It redirects you to an HTTPS version of the site. Well, what SSL stripping attack tries to do is it tries to catch you at that moment that you move from HTTP to HTTPS. The idea is that this is a really excellent phishing attack because people can actually be on the HTTP site, and when they try to switch to the HTTPS site, the attacker takes over and directs them to the site that they control. They've essentially stripped out the SSL communication between your browser and that site because they've done that before you've ever established that connection. So rather than US Bank, maybe they've taken you to usb4nk.com, something like that, and they have complete control over you, so they can, phish your details, whatever they want to do at that point. So the whole idea behind this is that this was only available because you allowed people to connect both the HTTP and HTTPS versions of the site. So if an attacker can listen to a particular site that they know people might give up valuable information, it gives them a good vector to be able to man-in-middle that connection and steal those details. But what if the HTTP variant of the site was never accessed? What if we never allowed someone to connect to the HTTP version of the site? This is exactly what HTTP Strict Transport Security, or HSTS, does. is it blocks the browser from connecting to the HTTP version of the site. What you do is, in your configuration, you set up a header. It's called strict transport security. And you communicate to the browser after someone has visited the site for the first time that says, hey, this site is HTTPS only. When a user tries to connect to this site, only ever allow them to connect to the HTTPS version of the site. That information is stored in the browser's memory, and the next time you try to access that site, if you try to access the HTTP version of the site, the browser will stop you from doing that. Instead of connecting you to HTTP, they change that URL essentially to HTTPS. Now, there's an important distinction here. This is not a redirect on your server, because a redirect would require you to first establish the HTTP connection, which means you're vulnerable to that man-in-the-middle attack, and then it would redirect you to HTTPS. Instead, the browser does the redirect for you. And I'm saying redirect in quotes because there's no redirect going on. They just say, we have been instructed by the website to never allow you to access HTTP, so we're just changing this to HTTPS, and then you can access the website. So if you do that, what you've done is you've really lowered the attack surface for this SSL stripping attack to the first time you visit the site. So if you try to visit the site for the first time in HTTP, it'll allow you to connect, and then you do the redirect, and that's when you get the header that informs the browser only ever connect to HTTPS from here on out. Your attacker must be ready to intercept you on that very first time you connect it. So you've greatly reduced the attack surface. You could go one step forward, and you can actually submit your website to Google Chrome, who manages a list for HTTP strict transport security preload sites. And so if you submit your site to Google, they keep a database of sites that should be HTTPS only, which means you don't even have that first attempt to go to HTTP. The code is in the browser itself. It knows, it's hard-coded in there that your site is an HSTS site. I've done that with my personal site, and it's, I guess, worked really well for me. Other browser vendors use that same list as well, so pretty simple. One thing I have to caution about, only do this after your mixed content issues are resolved. Only do this once you make sure that every part of your site works as HTTPS only. Because after you do this, and you've instructed the browser to not allow you to access the HTTP version of the site, the browser listens. It's not just a suggestion. The browser will listen to that and not allow you to connect to the site using HTTP. So you will block part of your site if you don't have everything figured out. So I recommend that people make sure that they first resolve their mixed content issues. They make sure they do a thorough audit of their site. Depending on how big of a site you work on, you sometimes find these weird corners of your site that you didn't know that existed, and you have to make sure that they're taken care of. So you only want to set this after you're absolutely sure that everything's looking good. So you would do something like this. This is what the header looks like. In Nginx, you would set it using add header, and then the header would actually just be strict transport security. And the value you set is just a max age value. So this just expresses how long should we keep this information. And if I recall correctly, that's 6 months. So you say for 6 months, don't allow this person to access the HTTP variant of the site. As a rollout strategy, what I would highly recommend is set that to something like 10 seconds. In case you realize you screwed something up, you will only affect browsers for 10 seconds, and then it will start ignoring this. There's a related concept, something I won't be talking about today, that's known as HTTP public key pinning. You actually pin your site to a version of a certificate that you want to use. And the only reason I'm not talking about this is because it's really dangerous, but I've done this on my personal site, and I've completely locked people out of the site because I decided to change my certificate. So you got to be really careful. This is a real danger. It's a great security feature, but you have to make sure that you're ready before you deploy it. Another thing you can do, and something that I want to warn everybody about, when you look up HTTP strict transport security online, the value that you're going to see people recommend you use is this. This is a great security recommendation, but it has a lot of danger if you just copy and paste this without knowing what it's doing. What you're doing is you're setting strict transport security, but you're also setting it for all of your subdomains. So it makes sense that a site would, want to have HTTPS on a main domain, but they have some I don't know, bespoke special site that they never got a certificate for, and it was just at a subdomain. What this will do is it'll enforce HTTPS on all of those subdomains, and if you're not prepared for that, you're going to have that issue where your site is just not accessible, right? So that's a huge, huge issue. Got to be careful about that. I really hate that people will, in examples, use this all the time, the include subdomains flag. I think it's really dangerous. You obviously want to use it where possible, but it is really dangerous. I hope I made that point clear. Be very careful when you use include subdomain. Any questions about HTTP strict transport security? Okay, we're going to move on to another concept that people are probably fairly familiar with, the idea of mixed content warnings with HTTPS. The problem is if you are running a site that is accepting an HTTPS connection and you allow other assets on the site to be accessible via HTTP, that's an attack vector. That allows an attacker to possibly man in the middle of that connection and cause some problems for you. Most browsers at this point will either block or warn on that content. They're kind of all over the place in how they handle that. Some will give you little notices where you can say, okay, I accept the security risk, let me see that content. The point is it's always a bad experience for your end users if you have HTTP content in an HTTPS page. So what you want to try to do is mitigate this as much as possible. And I want to give you a strategy for how you can find these different issues and start to improve them. Obviously, you could just go visit every page in your site, look for them, and fix them. But if you're doing something like maybe you're managing a CMS, has a lot of content, you can't always just go to every single page. You need something to automate this for you. And this is where content security policy headers come into play. I'm also curious, have people heard of CSP headers, content security policy? Is this a familiar topic? Okay, so it seems like something that hasn't got into the zeitgeist quite yet. What a content security policy does is it allows you to define a policy for your site for assets that are loaded on your site. So when the initial HTML is loaded, you pass a header that says, okay, there's other things that are going to load on the site, but they must follow my rules for this content. It allows you to protect against things like HTTP content loading on your site, but it also protects against XSS attacks where a random script is trying to load on your page that you did not authorize. A content security policy header may look like this. This is the one that I'm using on my personal website right now, and we're going to walk through exactly what this says. The initial part is just defining the header itself, content security policy. And then what we're going to say is, as a default, if I haven't specified something more specific for a type of content, this is the rule for that content. It must be loaded from my domain, not any third-party domains, and it must be via an HTTPS connection. That HTTPS bit, that's just matching on the first part of the URL. So all I'm saying is the first part of the URL must be HTTPS. And I added a colon in there. I think HTTPS would be just fine, but I added a colon in there, I guess, for extra safety. The next thing I'm saying is that I'm going to allow font sources to be loaded from HTTPS fonts.gstatic.com. I want to use Google Fonts, and I'm going to whitelist this, saying that I think this is okay for that to load. The more specificity you can get in your content security policy, the better. The reason I'm only doing fonts.gstatic.com is I believe that these URLs tend to change a little bit, and so I want to make sure that this can handle that. Next thing I'm going to say is that images, I'm not loading any images from third parties. If I'm going to rip off someone's images, I'm going to rip them off good and host it on my server. So I'm saying it can only come from my website, and it can only come from HTTPS. Now, I just literally pulled this from my site. This isn't perfect. This is actually redundant. Default source would have handled this just fine, but just for illustrative purposes, it's nice to have image source in there. Style source, basically where can CSS files be loaded from? From self, can be loaded from my site. My main CSS comes from there. Can be loaded from any HTTPS, and then also HTTPS fonts.googleapis.com, because Google Fonts will load CSS for your site. And finally, I'm going to load in script-source self, HTTPS, https://ssl.googleanalytics.com. So you all probably understand that is for my Google Analytics. I can see how many people visit my website. Now, if anything violates this policy, different browsers will handle this a little bit differently, but generally speaking, it's going to block that content. You know, the good browsers are going to do this well. The bad browsers, unfortunately, are going to have their little nits about this. So rather than just say, I want to block everything that's not HTTPS, I have a more specific policy in here. If you wanted to just block everything that's not HTTPS and you didn't care about all of this other stuff, you could just have default source HTTPS. And that would clearly on your site block all HTTPS, all non-HTTPS assets that try to load on the site. And you may be thinking like, well, why would I do this if browsers kind of already do this for me? There's two reasons. One, this will lead to more consistent behavior across browsers. Like I said, some browsers will only warn that you're loading HTTP content, while other ones will block it. This will give you a more consistent experience in that it will block it across different browsers. Obviously, it's not going to help for every browser because there's still bad browsers out there, but you're going to get a more consistent experience across the good browsers. The second reason is that there's a really cool addition you can do to content security policy. You can add a report URI, and any violation of this policy will be reported to the URI that you pass. This essentially allows you to monitor any HTTP or anything that violates your content security policy. Now, I realize that this slide is a little confusing, and I apologize. There's two versions of this. You can have a content security policy report only, meaning that you can set up a policy, tie it to a report URI, and it won't block anything, but it will send you all of the warnings. I love this strategy for initially deploying HTTPS. If I'm not sure if my site is ready for it, what I'll do is I deploy the main HTML as HTTP. But then I've done everything that I needed to do on the site to convert all my assets to delivering via HTTPS. And then I can deploy this policy that's a report-only mode, so it's not going to block anything, but it will report to me anything that's being loaded via non-HTTPS. And then that allows me to go fix all those issues. And once I'm able to run my site where I'm not like loading any assets that seem suspicious from non-HTTPS sources, I can just enforce that policy, switch everything to HTTPS at that point. So I have this in report-only mode. You can also remove report-only, and you can enforce your content security policy with a report URI, and you'll actually see these reports. All that report leads to is a post request to some URI that you specify, and it has different pieces of data depending on which policy you violated. But generally speaking, the important pieces you're going to get is it's going to tell you the page that sparked the warning. So it'll tell you the actual URL that you can go to and observe that warning, and then it'll tell you which piece of content violated that warning. So then you can track it down. You can figure out which URL on your page was causing that warning, fix it, so then you can be more confident in having resolved all of your mixed content concerns. We're going to look at this later on when we configure TLS for the server during our demo, and we'll actually use a free service that does this, and we can see what these reports look like. Another cool thing that is coming in CSP is update insecure requests. This is another flag that you can send, and it kind of makes sense what this is. It allows you to easily say, if I have something that's HTTP, I want it to automatically become HTTPS, and upgrade insecure requests will do this for you. Obviously, if you have your HTTP strict transport security set up, you'll automatically have that redirect via the browser. But what this will do is it'll handle third-party content for you as well. It'll try to load the HTTPS version of third-party content, which you cannot enforce HTTP strict transport security on. So any questions about content security policy at this point? Okay. We are getting close to the point where we're going to configure server. I'm going to do maybe 5 more minutes. We'll take a little break. just a natural point before we go into something completely different, and then we'll start working on configuring our server. But what I want to talk to you about first is how we're going to configure our certificate, how we're going to get our certificate. Now, the big news lately has been Let's Encrypt. People are talking about it. It's a new certificate authority that gives people certificates for free. Like, is there a better price than that? I guess there could be a certificate authority that could give you money to use them. But we'll accept it. It's good. So the big news is that it's a certificate authority and it's free. But they tend to kind of bury the lead because there's something way more exciting that the Let's Encrypt folks have done for us that is really going to change how certificate management happens. They created a new standard called the Automated Certificate Management Environment, or ACME for short. This is a standards track thing that's been approved. I'm blanking on the body that approved it. But what it does is it specifies a RESTful API for managing certificates. So they've spec'd out the way that you should build an API for a certificate authority to do all the tasks you need around certificate management. So this is things like registering with them, being able to get an initial certificate, doing whatever you need to do to validate the certificate. So you might need to like change your DNS, you may need to put some special file on your domain to show that you do own that domain, maybe email validation, those sorts of things. It also handles things like issuing new certificates or revoking certificates. What they've done is they've specified the standard that if other certificate authorities adopt, can give us a common interface for acquiring certificates. Now, people who have gotten a certificate before, was it a great experience? Was it awesome? No one is excited about getting a certificate. You're dealing with websites that were probably like built in, I don't know, the late 90s, something like, when SSL was first originated. The experiences are really bad. They're really confusing, and they turn off a lot of users because you can't figure out what the heck is going on. Even if you go to somewhere like Namecheap and you buy a certificate from them, you have a nice interface initially for like doing the purchase, but then they kick you into, Komodo or Rapid SSL's crazy, like weird back end where you're not even sure what everything means. It gets really confusing. So what ACME allows us to do is if you have a consistent API that all of these certificate authorities are using, we can develop clients that make this really nice and easy to provision certificates. And that's exactly what Let's Encrypt has done. They initially built the ACME protocol, and they built a new CA that uses the ACME protocol. Now what they've done is they've built a client on top of that. It's a Python-based client. Just work from the command line, and it allows you to specify, we're going to see how this works, allows you to specify the certificate you want, and it does things like automatic verification, so it'll add something to your server to verify that you actually own that domain. All happens in the background, and then all of a sudden you have certs. And this takes you less than 30 seconds to do. Really, really awesome, whereas the normal process for getting a certificate was really difficult. So the hope is that other CAs will want to do a lot of automating around their system. It's usually a better protocol. Just choose whatever you need. And anybody heard of SSLmate? Gonna be opening up their beta here in the next couple weeks. It would be my #1 recommendation. SSLmate is a command line utility that works with a certificate reseller that does pretty much the same things that Let's Encrypt does, shorter amount of time. So that's Let's Encrypt in a nutshell. We're going to be using this in our demo today. It's really exciting. The private beta invites have been rolling out over the last 3 weeks or so. I literally just got mine when I landed last night, and so we're ready. I can show you this. The public beta opens up supposedly on December 2nd. So everyone should be able to use this. I feel good about showing you this. It's not something that's going to be available to us soon. All right, so I think let's do another 10-minute break. Let's come back around 10:50, and then we will actually work on configuring TLS with all of our newfound knowledge about this protocol. right, well, it's 10:50, so let's get started again. So for the last bit of our tutorial, we're actually going to go through steps to configure TLS on a server. As part of this, we're going to be using this tool quite extensively. It's called SSL Labs. You can find it at sslabs.com/SSLtest. If you just go to sslabs.com, you're going to run into kind of a landing page. Just click the test your server now, something like that. This is going to be your best resource when you work on configuring TLS. If it tells you that something is wrong, something is wrong. You will listen to it. There's a lot of resources out there for kind of web development and engineering that will do these automated tests against your site to tell you, this is bad or that is bad. And a lot of times they have false positives and you kind of don't trust the issue. This is not one of those tools. If this tool tells you there's something wrong with your site, believe it and work on it until you get it right. What SSL Labs will do is it will connect to your site. It'll make a TLS connection to your site, and it runs it through all these different tests to look at the cipher suites you're using, to see if you're using, HTTP strict transport security, to see if your server software is vulnerable to things like the Heartbleed attack. It will check on all these different things and then report the results to you in a way that I think is pretty good in being able to enable you to figure out what the problem is and how to fix that. What we're going to do today as we work on configuring TLS is we're going to continually run our site through this. The site that we're going to be configuring is maybe a little weird, but it's 100screams.com. This is an old domain. I had to find an old domain that I could use. And this is a site my wife was going to build because she's really into horror movies. And she wanted to blog about them. And so she found this list of the top 100 horror movies of all time. And she was going to watch all 100 of them and blog about it. So we bought the domain. I tried to design the site, yada, yada, yada. It never happened. So I have this domain. That's why we're using this. So hopefully that's not too weird. Anyhow, it's already set up right now. It's set up working HTTP. If you try to connect to this site using HTTPS, we're going to see some errors. And if we try to run this through the lab site, we're going to, I think, get a major error here. Just going to try to do this. Assessment failed, unable to connect to server, because it'll only connect to the HTTPS version of it. So this is what you'll see if you don't even have anything set up yet. So we are going to take this site, this beautiful site, right? The one thing I want you to notice about the site is it's HTML, and there's some CSS loading. The styles, although very subtle, are implemented here. You can tell there's no underlines, which would be a default style. I'm just I pulled in some random bootstrap theme and applied it to this. Very, very minimal. You can tell there's a little bit of styling here. You're going to see that we may lose that styling as we convert over to HTTPS. So all we want to do by the end of this exercise is we want to have an HTTPS only site that mirrors this exact site. We want everything to be working as it is right now. We're going to go through this whole process to get there. So the very first thing you need to do when you're configuring a TLS site is usually get a certificate. This can be a little bit difficult depending on how your organization works. I'm going to step you through how you would do this. Ultimately, we're going to end up with certificates. If you do it the way that I do it, that I guess will be easy for you, but sometimes you might have to go through a different certificate authority or whatever. Ultimately, we're going to end up with a private key and a certificate that we need to use to configure a server. We're going to use Let's Encrypt for this. However, I'm first going to show you the old way so you appreciate the old way before we go to the new fun way. A saying I've used recently is that our children will never know what a certificate signing request is because these new tools will take that away. You used to have to create the certificate signing request, send it off to a CA, and they give you the certificate. So I'm going to show you how you would have done that in the past. Let me bring up my cheat sheet here. We're going to be using OpenSSL for this. Feel free to follow along on your own computer if you want to do this. Most computers are going to ship with OpenSSL by default. If you have it, feel free to follow. Is we initially need to generate a private and public key pair that we are going to peel that public piece of that off and send that off to the CA. If you recall when we went through the key exchange demo, there was the P and the G value that was distributed with the certificate. I told you that that was kind of public information. Those are values that are associated with your public key. Those are distributed in your certificate file. Your certificate file includes your public key as well as a bunch of other metadata. So before we can ask the certificate authority to give us a certificate, we need to generate that public key to give to them and say, wrap this up in a certificate because we need this information. The whole point of doing this is we're creating a public key and a private key that goes along with that. So we have that pair and only we have a possession of the private key. We never give that private key to any other entity. We keep that safe, but we pass the public key on because it's a public key. Everybody can have that. So to generate this public-private key pair, we're going to use this command, OpenSSL gen RSA. We're going to tell it that we want to do an encrypted private key. I recommend doing an encrypted private key because as you pass that key along, like right now I'm doing this locally on my desktop, I'm going to eventually want to move that to my server, and so I want it to be encrypted in case for whatever reason I did a bad job moving this to my server, someone got a hold of that key. I want it to be encrypted so that key is useless to them, and then when I get it to the server, I'll decrypt it. So we're saying generate a RSA key, and I should check in, are people able to read this? Can you see this okay? Contrast okay? I'm seeing more heads nodding yes, so I think we're good. OpenSSL, gen an RSA key. We're going to encrypt it with AES 256, and then I'm going to point to where I want this key. We're just going to save it to the desktop, or wherever we are right now, encrypted key.key, and then I'm going to tell it that I want the key to be 2048 bits strong. All right, so I'm going to push enter. It's going to prompt me for a passphrase. In this case, I'm just going to do 1234, 234, so I can remember it. And there we go. We now have this key. Oops. If you can see, now we have this listed right here under private encrypted key. We can take a look at what this looks like. And it's just kind of this big gobbledygook. It tells us that we have a private key. It tells us it's encrypted using AES 256. Now, embedded in the private key is our public key. What we want to do when we ask a certificate authority to give us a certificate is we pass on our public key. So we need to extract our public key from our private key and then wrap that in a certificate signing request. And we do this with another OpenSSL command, OpenSSL request, just REQ. It's going to be a new request. We're going to also tell it that we want to use SHA-256 for our hashing algorithm. We want to use this as the fingerprint for our certificate. You may have heard over the last year there was kind of this big controversy about SHA-1 certificates. SHA-1 certificates are essentially being deprecated by browsers because the SHA-1 hashing algorithm is vulnerable to hash collisions, that people can fake those fingerprints, so they needed to be able to get browsers to stop respecting them. Google has been leading the forefront on this. You need to make sure that you specify a SHA-256 hashing algorithm for your CSR. We're going to pass it in the private key, which contains the public key, private encrypted.key, and then we're going to specify the output to be our CSR.CSR. So I'm going to do this really quickly, and it's going to ask me to enter my passphrase because my key is encrypted here. We want to decrypt it so the program can use it. 1234 to encrypt it, and then it's going to ask information about me. Now, anything we enter here is going to be publicly available in the certificate. Anybody who goes and views this in a browser will be able to see all of this data that we enter. I caution you on that. Just, if you want to maintain some level of privacy, don't pass in information here. Another really tricky thing about OpenSSL is that it'll show you the default value. So in this case, AU, for whatever reason, is the default value. If I were to just push enter here, I'm going to get that default value. So AU would be the country name for my certificate signing request. To leave a blank value, you enter a period, right? Because that makes a lot of sense. This is so confusing. And you'll see some of the defaults they have are just like nonsense stuff. So here I don't want to have AU. State or province, if I didn't push dot, I would get some state in there. But just for purposes of illustration, I am going to say, I guess where I'm coming from, California. And then I don't want to specify city, so dot. Again, if my default here is Internet Widgets, what's PTY, whatever, limited? What? Why are they doing this? So dot again, dot for the organizational unit. This is the most important piece right here. You have to include this value, otherwise all the CAs will reject your certificate signing request. What you're telling them here is, I want a certificate for this domain. Now, this gets a little confusing. We're not going to go into this too deep, but you can only add one domain here. So if you want to cover both like example.com and www.example.com, you can't put both in here. You just have to choose one. Most certificate authorities, if you give them just like example.com, they'll give you back both example.com and www.example.com. There's a whole separate step with OpenSSL. You have to create a configuration file for your CSR to be able to specify multiple domains. It gets crazy. We're just doing this for demonstrational purposes. So we're going to do our domain of 100screams.com. I don't want to give them my email address. This is another really fun one. They prompt you for a challenge password, and this is embedded in your certificate. And if I were to put a password in here, that password is available in my certificate. People can see that in plain text. It's like some field that was maybe going to be used at some point. So obviously just leave this sucker blank. Optional company name, leave it blank. All right, we have generated now our CSR. We can view our CSR. Just going like this. This is what the request looks like encoded. If we actually want to decode it and look at the contents of this, just to see what you're actually sending to the certificate authority, we can use OpenSSL request -text -input. We just pass in CSR, and then we're going to say no output. So it's just going to display it to the screen. We're not going to actually save this anywhere. And this is what you get. It shows that it's a certificate request, and then it shows all the data that we added. For instance, the subject values. We have the state set as California. That's the only value that we actually added, other than the PN, which is the fully qualified domain name, 100 Screams. And then what it also includes is our public key algorithm. It contains information about how this key was generated. It's using the RSA algorithm. It's using an RSA public key of 2048 bits, and then it has the different values corresponding to the key. So we have our modulus. Modulus in this case was, remember when we did the math and it was G raised to A mod P? That's this number right here, encoded. And then we have our exponent right here, which is our G value encoded. So that's what we're sending. So when we, and then we're also telling it that we're using the SHA-256 algorithm to sign it, and then that's the signature. So this is our certificate signing request. When we are asking a certificate authority to give us a certificate, these are the necessary pieces of information that we need to pass along. This is what we would have done in pre-Let's Encrypt days, right? In pre-SSL. This because you need to understand what you're actually doing when you get a certificate. You create the public-private key pair. You prepare a certificate signing request that has your public key and all your important information, and you pass that on to the certificate authority. The certificate authority has you jump through a bunch of hoops, and eventually you get a certificate that you can use to secure your site. We don't have to do this because the Let's Encrypt client will do this all for us. So what I've done now is I've logged into the server that I'm using for this demo, 100screams.com. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And we're going to request, I've already set up Let's Encrypt, and I've already requested the certificates last night so I could make sure that this demo would actually work. So what we're going to be doing is I'll show you the command that you would normally do to get a Let's Encrypt certificate, but instead of getting the certificate initially, because I've already done that, we're going to be reissuing the certificate, which essentially is the same steps. The only thing different is that I'm not going to enter my email address, but this will feel very similar. So we need to go to Let's Encrypt folder, and then you'll see that there's some UX issues here. This command is going to get really crazy, but we're just going to do Let's encrypt dash auto. We're going to say we only want the certificate. Dash A, it's a standalone server, meaning that it's not going to try to automatically configure our server, because we have to do that, because this is a demo about configuring your server. We're not going to let this software do it, and then we're just going to leave, right? So we're going to say standalone, that we're going to configure our server by ourselves. Then we pass it the domain that we want, which is dash D. We're going to say 100screams.com dash D www.100screams.com. And then what's really cool is we're going to specify which Acme server we want to use. We're going to use the Let's Encrypt Acme server, but this client has been built in such a way that if another certificate authority was supporting Acme, we could point it at their server, and this should hopefully just work as long as that server was implemented correctly. This is a win for standards, right? This is the cool stuff we get when we do standards. So HTTPS acme-v01.api.let's-encrypt.com/directory. And then we're also going to pass in agree dev preview. There is a term of service that you need to accept through this process, but we can automate this by saying we just automatically agree by passing agree dev preview. So I'm going to push enter, and hopefully we get some certificates. It's updating some dependencies. And now it's running the command. Oh, I guess it is going to prompt me for my email address, so we'll do that. Uh-oh, we got an error. Well, live demos, right? This is bound to happen. Maybe I have requested too many certificates. Let me just look here really quick to make sure that this looks okay. Let's encrypt auto. Try again, see if this works. All right, well, what we found out is that sometimes there's issues with beta software. So fortunately, let's just act like that error message didn't happen. What it would have said is your certificate was created, and it would have told us right where it was. And I actually have saved off these certificates. And they are in live. So what we would have gotten if that worked, if we would have gotten all of these certificates added to this folder, Let's Encrypt Live / whatever your domain name is, what it's going to provide us is with the certificate in the .pem format. It's going to provide us with the chain, so this will be our intermediate certificate, and then it actually concatenates those two together with the certificate and the chain to give us the full chain, which will be our end leaf and our intermediate, but not the root. And then we also have our private key. They create the private key for us as part of this process. The private key always stays on our server. It's just as though we would have walked through that process with OpenSSL that I showed you. It would have created the public-private key pair, pass on the public key, and then we get our certificates back. So we actually have these certificates. If you want to see what these certificates look like, we can just take a quick look. That is the wrapping of the previous. I was looking at that first too. I was like, what is that? Live100screams.com, and then we'll just take a look at the cert. You can see there's one certificate in cert.pem, begin certificate, end certificate. We only see that once. If we look at the chain, we'll see begin certificate and then end certificate. And then if we look at the full chain, we're going to see two certificates. We'll see begin certificate and end certificate. Then we'll begin another certificate and end a certificate. I'm just doing this, belaboring this point to emphasize when you have your package of certificates, you want your end leaf certificate and you want all of your intermediates. Here we have our one end node certificate, and we have our one intermediate. That's all we want to serve when we're configuring our Nginx setup. We also have our private key. We're going to need this, and we can take a look at that if you're interested. And there it is. All encrypted and lovely looking. Sorry, I should say it's encoded. This is not an encrypted version of your private key, so if you move this to another server, someone picks that off, you're in trouble. You can encode that if you want. We ultimately want to have this unencrypted on the server, because every time we start our server, if it's encrypted, we would have to decrypt it. So meaning every time we start a server, we would have to enter our password. We don't want to do that. We have a certificate. Yay. The Let's Encrypt demo did not go as well as I wanted it to. I'm sorry about that. I was trying to show you guys Let's Encrypt without adequate preparation, but should it, get some of these details ironed out, I think I hit their API limit, because I think it was like 10 requests a day or something like that during the beta, and I probably was just too giddy with excitement making requests to it last night and screwed that up for my 24-hour period there. It's really cool. I highly encourage you to use it. If you're not going to be using Let's Encrypt, just realize that you're going to have to go through that public key, private key creation, CSR, and then when you get your certificates back, make sure you combine your end leaf with your intermediate. So any questions about that? Any questions about certificate acquisition? Great, so we're moving along nicely. Let's talk about how we're going to prepare Nginx for TLS. Now, I'm logged into a server here. This is a live server. We're going to be coding against the actual site that hosts 100screens.com. The reason we're doing this is we want to be able to evaluate this with SSL Labs as we progress through our configuration. We want to see the problems that we're going to experience with Nginx as we go along. I haven't done a lot with the server. I booted up a DigitalOcean droplet. It's running Ubuntu 14.04. All I did was I initially updated every piece of software, make sure we're running the latest everything, and then I added in basic dev features like Git, curl, wget, those sorts of things. And then I installed Nginx. I installed Nginx from the mainline branch, and we're going to use Nginx for this demo primarily because, well, I like Nginx a lot. I like it better than Apache, Tomcat, some of these other ones. So I like this quite a bit, and Nginx gives you one of the better sets of features that you can configure for SSL, so it's a really good teaching example. So I think this should work out really well. To install Nginx, all I did was install from the mainline branch in Nginx. Nginx has a stable and a mainline. If you're just using your normal app repositories, you're going to get the stable branch. I always install mainline because it's ahead in terms of features. So for instance, we'll be able to implement HTTP2 with this example that we walked through today, whereas if you're using stable, you wouldn't be able to. So all I did was I installed it. I added one configuration file to make sure that the site was working, and that's it. I'm going to use transmit because it's a little easier to see where we are in the site. This is just an FTP client. We're going to pull files down into Sublime Text so we can see what we're doing. All I've done is I've added a file to etc. Nginx conf.d, and I've added 100screams.com.conf. At least on Ubuntu, the default setup for Nginx is that any .conf files in the conf.d folder will be pulled in when Nginx starts up. So I've just dropped a file in here. What I'm trying to show you is that there's no magic behind the scenes. I've done very little effort to set up this site initially. And let's go ahead and download and look at this file. This is all I've added to make sure that this site works. In Nginx, you set up server blocks. You tell it which port to listen to, so we're bound to port 80. You point it to a server name, so if you get a request that comes into port 80 for 100screams.com, this server block will be used for the configuration. I set up an access log location and an error log location, so we're logging things in case we have any errors when we're working on this. And then I set up a location block. A location block allows you to essentially intercept a path in Nginx, and then when this path comes through, you route it to specific files on your site. You can have specific configurations for those types of paths. So right now, it's just a single page. So slash, I'm going to load everything from server/100screams.com, and then it's going to load up index.html as the default. This is as basic as it can get with Nginx. If you're not familiar with Nginx, I hope this makes sense. Is anybody confused about what's going on with this setup? All right, so our goal is just to move to HTTPS only site. We're not going to do a lot of other fancy configuration or anything like that. I want to focus primarily on just getting our server working with HTTPS. So let's start doing that. The first thing we do is we now have a block that's set up just to listen to port 80. HTTPS connections come through port 443, so we need to set up a server block that's going to listen to that. So we'll say listen to 443. And there's a special thing you need to do in Nginx to tell it that we actually want to do SSL handshake for this particular block. You just say SSL right there. All the names in Nginx regarding HTTPS are going to be all SSL, not TLS. Kind of a bummer, but that's how it is. Then we're going to tell it which server name to listen to. And ultimately, we are going to make everything resolve to www.100screams.com. Just because I kind of like www on things. And then what we're going to do, just to make this a little bit easier for ourselves, we know that this configuration works to serve a site. So I'm just going to copy this configuration into the other block. I know it works. I don't want to deal with figuring out if something else works. We're just going to copy and paste this in here. So at this point, all we're going to do is we're going to have a mirrored connection. We're going to have things listening at port 80. And port 443, and the only difference is that port, really. So with that in place, I've uploaded the file already. I'm going to go back to my server, Nginx, restart. Service, Nginx, restart. Okay, what do you think is going to happen when I try to load up HTTPS 100screams.com? Actually, it should be www, right? Anybody want to place bets? Chrome will tell me it's insecure. Any other thoughts? Yeah, I haven't configured the certificate. So we're all expecting things to go poorly here, right? Yeah, okay. You're absolutely right. So before, when I didn't have anything configured, I got error connection. I can't even remember what that said before. But now it says error connection reset. So basically, Nginx is just not allowing us to connect to this. This is going to be probably a 500 level error, I think. We can take a look at what it, nope, we're not even connecting to the server, so it's not even giving us anything back. And this makes sense. We all knew this, right? We didn't have any certs configured. We're smart people. We could see that that was coming. So the next thing that you would obviously want to do is, and I think we all kind of figured this out, is we want to configure our certificates. So let's do SSL_certificate, and we'll point this to our Let's Encrypt folder live 100screams.com/fullchain.pem. So whether you're working with Nginx or any other server, the important part here is that we are going to identify our certificate as both our end certificate and our intermediate certificate. That's what we're linking to with this directive. In Apache or other servers, they're probably going to have a different name for it. But again, when you're linking to your certificate, you want both the end certificate and the intermediate. You absolutely do not want to have the root certificate. And I mentioned the root certificate stuff because sometimes when certificate authorities give you your package of certificates, they'll include the root certificate. And there's a way in SSL Labs for us to detect that, and we can deal with that. So we link in our SSL certificate, and then let's link in our private key, because we need to have our private key as well. So certificate key is the directive. I like to line things up nicely here. And then we are going to point to etc. Let's encrypt live 100screams.com/priv key. That's what they call it. So all we're doing is we're pointing it to our SSL certificate and our key, and this should be enough for us to get a connection now. So that is going up to the server, get confirmation that that's done. Nginx-T tells you whether you have a configuration error before you restart the server. I think that got up there, but let's check. Service Nginx restart. If this works, we should now be able to connect. There we go. We connected to the site. This is fantastic, isn't it? This is what we wanted. If we click the little green icon, we can see our connection information. We can see that it's encrypted using Let's Encrypt Authority-X1. Now, what I told you before is that we want to test this with SSL Labs. And so what I want to do, we're going to go run our first test. Because now, this is a point where I think most people stop. We got it to work. There's a green icon. We must be good, right? Let's just move on. There's no problems with this. Or we can connect to our site. Well, we want to be a little bit more thorough than that. And so let's go ahead and connect to www.100screens.com. I'm not going to show the results on the board. We're going to submit it, and we're going to let this test run. This test usually takes about a minute to run. And so we're not sitting here just looking at this blank screen. Let's move on to one other step that I want to kind of clean things up for, and then we'll come back and look at this in just a little bit. Now, I said before that what I want to develop is an HTTPS only site. That means if I only want to serve this site from HTTPS, I need to redirect any connections to HTTP to HTTPS. So let's handle that in our server configuration as well. Right now, we're accepting connections on port 80, and we're going to go ahead and serve the site. We don't want to do that anymore. So I'm going to intentionally block that. And Nginx has a really easy module for this. Return 301, and then we'll tell it where we want to go. And we can pass it the request. I think it's URI. Just let me double check that. Yes. So all we're saying now is if we have a request come through port 80 for 100screens.com, just go ahead and redirect it as a 301 redirect. Now we want to make sure we get all of our redirects set up, and so I'm going to copy this. We also want to make sure if this comes through www.100screens.com, we'll redirect that as well. So let's go ahead and save that. I think that uploaded. We'll restart. Now if I go to the HTTP version, we should get redirected. And we do. Great. Is there any redirect that we might be missing here? Anything that we forgot to set up? There's one more redirect we're going to need to set up, and that is if we get a request on 443 to 100screens.com without the www, we're going to want to redirect it to the www. I think it generally makes sense to make everything resolve to one URL. We're going to wait for that, though. The catch with that redirect is it needs to have good TLS properties as well, because that connection is going to be via TLS. We don't want to neglect that. We want to make sure that that redirect has good properties. All right, so I just saw that our SSL Labs rating was done. What? We got a B? We have a green icon. Why do we have a B? Like, table flip here, right? Like, everyone should be, like, so mad about this. Okay, one of the secrets is that Nginx is a great server, but its default TLS configuration is a B. It doesn't give you great TLS out of the gate. And there's some issues that we'll walk through with SSL Labs. By the way, I encourage all of you to run this site through SSL Labs as you're listening to this, so you can kind of explore things on your own. But I'll walk you through some of the issues and also show you how to use this tool. First of all, can people read this? Okay. I'm really sorry I don't control this, so I can't make things bigger. I can just push the Apple Plus button. So we know just kind of from looking at the high-level stuff, our certificate looks to be good. We got 100 rating. Like, that's what I always aim for. I like 100%, so we're good there. Protocol support is pretty weak. It looks like about a 70, so maybe we need to fix something there. Key exchange is in the green, so I guess that's good. It's an 80. And cipher strength is 90. This actually doesn't give you a lot of information. You don't really know what to do with this. What I want to kind of relate this back to is these things map somewhat to those 4 different areas that we're talking about. Certificate's going to map to authentication. Protocol support kind of includes everything. Key exchange, obviously key exchange. And cipher strength encapsulates a lot of these different areas that we talked about. As we scroll down, we get better information about what problems we've been facing. So anything in yellow is going to be a problem we should address. The first thing this tells us is this server supports weak Diffie-Hellman key exchange parameters grade capped to B. Now, given all the things we've talked about today, can anybody kind of figure out what that might mean? Does anybody have any ideas? Yes, sir. Yep, so one response was that maybe it's using the older Diffie-Hellman protocol rather than the newer elliptic curve. Yes, I will accept that as a correct answer here. Anybody else want to take a stab at this too? More specifics? Yeah. Yeah, so what this gentleman said was that perhaps Nginx is using older key exchange mechanisms, older algorithms that are sort of less than ideal, and they're there for compatibility with older browsers, and you could force the server to use those algorithms. It might be. Anybody else want to take a stab of like more specifics what this might mean? Okay, I'll just tell you. So before, when we did that key exchange, when we did the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, we had values A, B, P, and Q, and that would generate the key that we use for encryption. What this is telling us is that the values we're using are weak. In particular, we're using weak A and B values. In actual Diffie-Hellman key exchange nomenclature, I think they're called like YC and YS. But for what we've talked about today, the A and B values are weak. They're small. Like the A and B values that we use today, I think it was 5 and 8. The numbers are just really small. And so it means that by listening in on that communication, we could probably crack through brute force the actual secrets and then decrypt that. So because we're doing that, our grade is capped to a B. If anybody heard of the attack that was recently discovered called logjam, this is in relation to logjam. The idea was that there's a number of servers like Nginx, for instance, that are deployed with weak Diffie-Hellman parameters by default. And what's even worse is they tend to use the same parameters, meaning that an adversary that wants to crack this can do a lot of pre-computation to basically develop a chart that would allow them to break your key. We're getting capped to a B because we're using these weak Diffie-Hellman parameters. So what do you think we should do first? Should we fix that? Does anyone not want to fix it? How about if I frame it that way? Okay, cool. So we're all in agreement that we're going to fix these weak Diffie-Hellman parameters. And this requires us to use OpenSSL again. So we'll do OpenSSL DHparam, and then we specify where we want it saved. For whatever reason, I've developed this habit of saving everything in user certs. Param.pem, and then we're going to say we want parameters that have 2048-bit strength. It's going through trying to find safe parameters for us, and this is going to take a while. It already tells us this is going to take a long time. So while that's happening, I want to come back to SSL Labs and we'll talk about a little bit more. What do you think about this second yellow line. This server does not support forward secrecy with the reference browsers. What does that mean to us at this point? We're using the same key with everything it's talking to. We're at risk of using that same key when certain browsers communicate, or certain browsers communicate with that server. We can drill down and get a little bit more information on this. We're going to skip a bunch of stuff and then come back up. But if we look at all of the reference browsers that it tests, right here, there will be a no FS for forward secrecy or an FS for forward secrecy. And we could see that the cipher that is chosen for Android 2.3.7 does not use forward secrecy. If we scroll down a little bit more, we can see that IE7 Vista, IE8 and XP, no forward secrecy, IE10 on Windows Phone, IE11 on Windows Phone. We can see all the browsers that are not using forward secrecy. This is something that we're going to want to fix as well, because I think the point had been made that forward secrecy is a really good thing and we want to fix that. So that's the second thing that we are eventually going to fix. Let's see if our Diffie-Hellman parameters are ready. They are. Let's go ahead and take a look at them, make sure that they're actually there. All right, this is basically just encoding a couple different numbers that we're going to use for our Diffie-Hellman parameters. And what we need to do now is link them up with our configuration. So we'll go back to our configuration right here, and we will point to those parameters. SSL DH param, etc. SSL user certs DH param dot pem. That's uploaded. We're going to restart Nginx. And then what we do here is we clear this cache, although let's clear it in another browser or another window. So while that's generating, we're just going to try to fill time for a minute to see what that does. I want to be very clear, like as we fix certain things in our configuration, I want you to be able to see what this does to SSL Labs. But there's more in SSL Labs we haven't covered, so let's look at that. The first thing that SSL Labs tells you is information about your server key and your certificate. Important things that you want to pay attention to here is you want to make sure that the alternative names typically includes your domain plus the www. It's pretty common for people to try to connect your site at either place. You really want to protect both of those, so if you have redirects in place, those both enjoy the protection of a TLS connection. And it'll give you a little flag it'll be a yellow flag. It won't mess with your score, but it'll say like this is confusing, and it'll kind of call that out for you. Important things here is it gives us our key strength, 2048 bits for an RSA key. That's kind of the minimum. You can increase that key, and in fact, we're going to see that SSL Labs won't give us a perfect 100 score unless we were to increase that key to 4096 bits. However, we don't want to do that because 2048 is sufficient, and if we keep increasing the size of the key, we're going to pay costs in terms of performance. So initially delivering the key is going to be much bigger. So in the initial part of the handshake where we have to send that, it's going to take longer to push that data to the client. It's also going to take longer to do the encryption because we're using a bigger key. And then it'll also tell us that our issuer here is Let's Encrypt Authority X1, and the signature algorithm is also going to be really important. It's a SHA-256. If you get any warning about using SHA-1, that's a huge issue that you need to fix. The other thing we're going to see here is that it's going to point out the certificates that we've also provided as part of that chain. This can give you all sorts of different output. Sometimes you'll find that the same certificate could be signed by two different chains. It'll note this for you if that's the case. That doesn't really mean anything to you. It just kind of gives you that information so you're aware of it. And then what it'll do is it'll show you the whole certificate chain. So it shows you that we initially have the 100screens.com certificate, and that is signed by the Let's Encrypt Authority X1 And we have sent both of those from the server. This is the way we should be doing it. And then it'll show that that's ultimately signed by DST root CAX3. This is the certificate that's in the browser that's signing the certificate chain. If you were to include that root certificate, and this happens a lot because sometimes when you go through the certificate acquisition phase, they will give you the root certificate in the full package and people just put that up on the server. It will mention that to you and it'll say that this is an extra download. You don't need to be doing this because the root is not going to be used at all. The only trusted roots will be in the browser themselves. And the problem that you're going to face with that is it's a performance issue. Those first bits that you send on the wire when you're making these connections are super important that you keep them as small as possible for a very fast connection. So you want to make sure you're not loading that up. Next thing we see is that we're using protocol TLS version 1, version 1.1, and 1.2. Up until sometime this year, Nginx by default would do an SSL3 connection, but they removed that because there were significant vulnerabilities found in SSL3, so that was a good thing that they did. What we're going to be doing here eventually is we're going to hard code that into our configuration, and the reason I do that is if anybody takes this configuration and is using an older version of Nginx, they may still be serving via SSL3. We want to be very explicit about this. So I'm going to stop there with this version of SSL Labs, and we're going to jump over to the new one after we added the DH params. Here we go, the big reveal. Hey, A-. Good work, everyone. We worked on that together. I feel good about this. This is good. So we no longer have that warning that told us that our grade was capped to a B because of the DH params. We still have a grade reduced to A- because of the forward secrecy. Let's just take a look through this and see what has changed here. Okay, one thing you're going to notice is that down here, oh, sorry, nope. Where is this? Okay, so this is the new configuration. We see DH public server param reuse. And then if we were to look at this other one, scroll all the way down. Oh, there it is. Sorry, this is the one. I apologize. Uses common DH params. The old one said yes, replace with custom if possible. And then here we have no. That's what increased our grade from a B to an A-. All right, so there's a couple things I've already talked about and trying to fill time there. Let's go ahead and implement a couple more things. First of all, I want to hard code the protocols that we're using. And so we can do this with SSL protocols directive. And I always misspell these because there's something kind of strange about the way they do this. So let me look at my cheat sheet. TLS version 1, and then TLS version 1.1, and TLS version 1.2. So you can imagine when I configure this, I usually do TLS version 1.0, and then it doesn't work. So we've updated that. Again, this is what we were using before. We're going to go ahead and use these three protocols because we want compatibility. The main issue that we would have here is if we didn't use TLS version 1, we would not support any IE browser less than IE 11. Usually you can't deploy a website with that kind of support, so we need to use TLS version 1. Obviously, the newer protocols are going to be more secure, so if you're able to deploy a site with TLS version 1.2 only, that's fine. I do that on my personal website because I know that my audience is mostly developers who have updated stuff on their site. Yeah. Oh, really? Oh, really? Okay. So, okay, so you're, okay. So I should say that with one of the configurations that you could do is remove TLS 1.0, and then you would have support for IE10 with TLS version 1.1. And then, so let me kind of restate that. If you were to still want to support IE10, but not IE9, you can do version TLS 1.1 and above. So I usually stick with this for like if we were to move to HTTPS on wire.com, we would do TLS version 1 because we want to support IE9 and above, unfortunately. So thank you for that correction. So if you want IE10, you can get away with doing TLS version 1.1 and higher. So I'm not going to show you what changes this has on SSL Labs because it has nothing. But what we do want to do now is we want to start addressing this issue. We have a problem with forward secrecy not being supported for all of our reference browsers. And there's a couple issues that are going on. If we look at our Cipher Suite list, the Cipher Suite, and we're using a lot of bad Cipher Suites. Another thing to note here, right up here, it says sorted, oh, you probably can't see that, sorted by strength as the server has no preference. What this is saying is that our server has not said use these Cipher Suites and use them in this order. So the browser can connect pretty much using whatever it wants. The browser is going to have a lot stronger influence on this. And thus we're going to be using things that use something like 3DES for encryption, which is less than ideal because it's really, really slow. We probably have some, we're using Camellia, which is not going to be ideal. We're going to be using non-forward secrecy key exchanges like just RSA. RSA can be for key exchange. These are some problems. So we want to pull good Cipher Suites and we want to enforce the order of those Cipher Suites. That will allow us to have forward secrecy. So this is where I tell you to copy things. Mozilla has an excellent generator, Mozilla SSL configuration generator. It's probably easier just to Google that to find it. And what it does is it will provide you with different configurations for different browsers, or different servers. So you can choose Apache, Nginx, HAProxy, or AWS ELB. And then you can choose the level of support that you want for different browsers. Yes, sir. Can you say that? I'm having trouble hearing you. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely, yeah. So the question was, I said that we're going to address forward secrecy, and just to repeat and clarify what I said there. So we're going to address forward secrecy by specifying the Cipher Suites that we're going to use in the site. Forward secrecy is going to be affected by the different key exchange algorithms we use, and we want to be sure that we are only deploying TLS with Cipher Suites that support key exchanges that will allow us to have forward secrecy. And the way we're going to do that is by using the Mozilla SSL configuration generator. Because we know like a really good Cipher Suite, I already told you a really good one, that's the one we walked through a while ago now, but we also want to have good fallbacks. And unless you're like a cryptographer or if you're writing the TLS protocol, figuring these out yourself is going to be an absolute mess. So Mozilla has put together a list that you can just copy and paste, and I would encourage copying and pasting from this provider. And what it allows you to do is pick the server software that you're using. In this case, we're using Nginx. And then it has 3 different configurations for each server. It has modern, intermediate, and old. And what they're talking about here is the compatibility level with browsers. So if you only want to support modern browsers, go to modern, and it'll tell you right here that this will support Firefox 27, Chrome 22, IE 11, Opera 14, Safari 7. I tend, for the most part, to probably encourage people to do intermediate, so you have a little bit more support. It really depends on how much you care about Internet Explorer. This intermediate will get us all the way down to IE 7. So if that's important for you, then this is the Cipher Suite list that you're going to want. So then what we're going to do is we're basically just going to rip off this line, this SSL ciphers, and this is a really long line. It goes all the way out there. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste this into our configuration. So that's what it looks like. It's pretty crazy, isn't it? There's no sane way that just like a regular web developer that hasn't studied this for a long time could put this list together and do a good job doing it. The folks at Mozilla know what they're doing with this, so I accept that it's okay to do that. And we've now all been through the training. We know what a Cipher Suite is. We know what it specifies. So I think we're comfortable doing that at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. My notifications are not working correctly, so I think that's up. I'm just going to make sure I didn't break anything. Looks good. And then we're going to go service, Nginx restart. And then we're going to go ahead and load this one more time in SSL Labs. And so we're not just staring at SSL Labs, we're going to keep moving on with another thing that we want to handle. Is there anything that anybody can think of that we haven't implemented yet that I've talked about today as being really important? HSTS, HTTP Strict Transport Security. We want that, right? Now, given what I said already, how would we implement it? Any ideas? Perfect. Add a line to our Nginx config telling us to send the header. You know what? We're going to back up just a second because I forgot to do something that's really important, okay? This is what happens with live demos. Not only did we want to send our cipher suites, we specify our cipher suites, but with Nginx, and I don't even know why that this is an option, but there is a setting that is SSL prefer server ciphers. We turn this on. This should be a default. This to me is insane that we have to turn this on. What this says is that the ciphers that we specify, use them in that order. We prefer the server to make the choice on which ciphers are delivered rather than the browser having more influence on that choice. So we want to actually set this to on, and this is actually going to make a big difference in SSL Labs. So we're going to clear this cache. Shoot, we got to wait till this finishes, and then we can do it in 1 second, I guess. So we still have an A-, specifically because we have not, we did not specify the prefer server cipher order. I don't understand why anybody would ever want that turned off, so it should be defaulted to on. Okay, sorry about that. We're going to come back now to HTTP strict transport security, and the gentleman who shouted out that we need to emit a header is absolutely right. And in Nginx, this is really simple with add header. And we're going to do strict transport security. And we're going to set this a value of max age equals 315.3600. Recommendations I've read about this before essentially specify that this should be at least a month. Anything less than a month kind of undermines the security of it because you want someone who visits your site once and then comes back the next time to be able to get HTTPS. If this is less than a month, then if they come back in like 31, 32 days, they can still access the HTTP version of the site. So, you know, I think I usually do 6 months. That's why I think that this number is 6 months, but I can't verify it at the moment. So we'll go ahead and set this. And while I'm doing that, let's look at our latest SSL Labs score, and I want to show where it will talk about strict transport security. Right here is where it tells us how we're doing in terms of strict transport security. Tells us no, we are not doing strict transport security. It also will report on whether we have HSTS preloaded or not, and this is the preload values that you can add to the Chrome browser that are also propagated out to other browsers as well. So you can add this, just Google it and you can find the URL to be able to add this. Again, only do that once you have everything transitioned over. And let's see if we have our latest test. So here's our latest test. And we have something configured incorrectly. Oh, shoot. I forgot to update the server. Okay, so at this point we now have HSTS and we have the preferred server order. Because I don't want you to sit there waiting for another run to completely finish, what we would have seen in that case, had I correctly configured things, we would have gotten an A rating. We would have no longer had an A-. Forward secrecy would have been configured correctly. I'll show you those results once this one is done. But we would have been capped at an A, and the reason we'd be capped at an A is you cannot get an A+ until you implement HTTP strict transport security. So if I haven't missed yet another thing, we should see an A+ when this is done running. One thing I want to note, let's go to this one here. You're going to note that like we're kind of all over the place with our ciphers right now because we haven't had that preferred order. This is the order that SSL Labs is seeing them in. And so we're going to do like RSA, then ECDHE, and then RSA, then DHE. When we finish this, you're going to see this looks a little bit more organized because we're going to prefer cipher suites that use the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, meaning you're going to see a lot of the ECDHE and DHE at the top of this list because those are the ones we prefer, and we're only going to do other ones way at the bottom list if we absolutely have to. Okay, and I'm going to change something else about this site really quick. I forgot to revert this back when I was practicing. Right now, everything's loading correctly on the site, but that's no fun. We need to see what happens when it's not loading correctly. So I'm going to revert this to use HTTP style sheets, and then let's see what happens here. Okay. So what I've done is I faked this. I created a situation where you have mixed content. And let's see what Google will tell us about this. In our mixed content situation, we're going to see console errors, and it's going to say mixed content. The page at www.100screams.com was loaded via HTTPS, but requested an insecure style sheet. This request has been blocked. So Chrome is just blocking this right now. And they're not giving us any sort of warning. They're just blocking it. We're still secure, but our site's not loading the way we want it to. As you can see, our styles have changed quite a bit. That's the next issue we're going to fix. Let's just see if SSL Labs is done so we can finish that off. So SSL Labs is done. We have an A+. Good job, everyone. All right. Note that we get the server supports HTTP strict transport security with long duration. Grade is set to an A+. If we go look at our cipher suites now, doesn't this just look a little bit cleaner and nicer than what we saw before? It kind of cascades down nicely. We can see that there's ECDHE is preferred, and then DHE, a lot of the Diffie-Hellman stuff, and then we only fall back to non-Diffie-Hellman stuff once we've tried all of these cipher suites. We'll also notice now that every single one of these browsers, when we've done the handshake simulation, is protected via forward secrecy. And then down here, we're going to see that we use strict transport security. So everything is looking really good. We now have an A+ configuration for SSL Labs. The configuration itself, I think, was really easy, right? Like, we could have done this in 5 to 10 minutes. Knowing what you're doing is really hard, and that's why you spent all this time here today. But this is what you need to do to get an A+. But we're not done, right? Because I broke our site by pointing to HTTP, part of our site. So we are going to implement strict transport security, content security policy to enforce what we want to do with the third-party stuff that's loading in our site. And to do this, we're going to add another header, and I'm actually going to go to a cheat sheet here so I can copy and paste this, which is kind of long. We're going to add one more header, and this is our content security policy header. What we're going to tell it is that by default, we only want to allow stuff coming from our site and coming from HTTPS URLs. We're going to say for style source, only stuff loading from our domain or this very specific style sheet called maxcdn.bootstrapcdn.com/bootstrap, blah, 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 blah. We're going to allow 2 specific style sheets to load. And then, finally, we're going to point to a report URI site at reporturi.io. This is going to allow us to record any violations of this policy. So let's go ahead and send this up. Let's reload our server. And let's see what this looks like when we have our new content security policy implemented. Okay, so the messages we got were different. We still see the same result. We're not loading those assets. But what this says is something a little bit different this time. It says refuse to load style sheet, and it points it out, because it violates the following content security policy directive. It violates the style source directive. So because it's not one of these 2 URLs that we've whitelisted, it won't load. And Chrome is doing a good job enforcing that. If we pop over to the network tab, we're also going to see that we made another request to this 907 thing. I'm having trouble making this a little bit bigger. Well, and what this does is this is making a request to report URI.io. It's a post request, and it contains this content right here. It's going to report on the actual URI that was blocked. It's going to report the document URI, which is where that content was blocked. So if you, as a person who is trying to prepare this site for HTTPS only, you would go to 100screams.com, you would look for this URL, and you would try to correct that. And before we do that, before we fix it, I just wanted to briefly show you report URI. And we can see these start to pour in real time. If we load the site a couple times, we should be able to see that over here. There we go. We're seeing these reports. Report URI is kind of interesting. It's really the only player in the game right now that will collect these for you. It's free. I mean, if you're like a large website, I don't know how free that would be for a long time, but there's not any like good open source products to use for this. So if you want to play around with this, and if maybe it's a smallish site, this might make sense, but I would probably talk to them before I threw tons and tons of traffic at them. And I'll show you all your reports, and you can see these in graphs or whatnot. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and fix this up, and you all know how to do this very easily. We just need to change this back to HTTPS. We don't even need to restart the server. We should just reload the page. And we have our styling back. You'll notice now that the two bootstrap files are loading, and then we no longer have console errors. So this is the process that you would go through if you want to suss out all of those different mixed content issues. Set a content security policy, and it will be enforced. I just want to check my cheat sheet here one last time to make sure we have everything covered. Oh, there's one more thing, or two more things we need to do here. Does anybody know what we're missing? Kind of a smallish thing. Our TLS configuration is solid, but there's one other thing we're missing. We need to we need to implement that redirect from HTTPS 100screams.com to HTTPS www.100screams.com. And this is really easy. Basically what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy this whole server configuration that we already set up and paste it. Now if I was doing this in the real world, I would create a separate like tls.conf file and just include it into these blocks. But for brevity, we're going to just do this. We're going to change the server name. We're going to keep all of our SSL configuration values the same. And then we're going to change this. Instead of serving the content, we're just going to return 301 HTTPS www.100screams.com request URI. Reload the server. And now if we go to the non-www version, we're redirected to the www version. We can check this all over the place now. We're always going to end up at the www.100screams.com version of the site. Okay, one last thing. This is it. This is the closing parts of this. What I want to show you too is now that we're on Nginx, we're on the latest version of Nginx, we can get HTTP2, which is really cool because we get huge performance gains with this. If you have your SSL configuration all set up, all you need to do is type in HTTP2 right there. And you now have HTTP2 connections. And this is a little hard to demonstrate. Actually, I don't really have a good way of demonstrating that right at the moment. But now our site is connected over HTTP2. Oh, you know what? I can show you. You can go to Chrome, Net Internals. And then if you go to HTTP2, we should see 100 screams. There it is. Can I make this bigger? This is kind of a secret configuration thing in Chrome. You can see that we're connected to this via H2. So we now have HTTP2 support. That you did all this hard work for TLS. If you're on Nginx, it's that easy to give yourself HTTP2 support. All right, so I have just two more slides I want to go over, and then we will wrap this up. I do other talks on HTTP2, but HTTP2, essentially is a updated version of HTTP. Our last version of HTTP came out in, if I remember correctly, is 1999. It's HTTP 1.1. There's been small changes since, but what HTTP 2 does is it addresses issues with latency in the HTTP 1.1 protocol. The reason why websites tend to be slow is there's a ton of latency. There's a ton of just back and forth with the server that is for nothing more than just establishing connections. HTTP 2 makes a lot of optimizations around that, so you basically open up a single connection to a server, and then you can multiplex through that connection, so you can be making requests and getting responses along that server. So basically, what would happen is if you take an HTTP website and then you switch it over to HTTPS over HTTP 1.1, you're going to see some degraded performance because of that extra TLS handshake. But if you flip that over to HTTP 2, you're probably going to be on par with your HTTPS site and your HTTP site. So the big headline for HTTP 2 is performance. You get a lot better performance out of HTTP 2. If anybody wants to talk about that, I love talking about that as well. Yes. Question was, if you turn on HTTP 2 for Nginx, does it fall back to HTTP 1 for browsers that can't connect via HTTP 2? Yes, it does. One of the things that Nginx does that I'm not a huge fan of is when they implemented HTTP 2, they deprecated Speedy. So it will not fall back to a Speedy connection. The problem is you have these browsers that did support Speedy, and so now those browsers that did support Speedy, that just like an older version of Chrome, for instance, or an older version of Firefox, instead of getting that like multiplexing and all of that good stuff, because Speedy and HTTP 2 are essentially similar, it's now an HTTP 1 connection instead of HTTP 2. So I don't know why they deprecated that when they had the code. You don't want to be building for Speedy now, but HTTP 2 and Speedy are very similar. I just need to fix one thing. We're really close, everyone, I promise. Lunch is on the way. Okay, I want to leave you with just some parting words. We figured out how to implement an A+ TLS setup. We know how to do that now. I hope you have some good grounding in what TLS actually is. I know this was a long tutorial. Hopefully it was helpful. What I want to impart on you now is we really need to make sure that once you deploy that site, you have that A+ connection, that you don't leave it. Just like any other code that you write, TLS needs maintenance. We are in this kind of weird period where there's a lot of attention towards TLS. We seem to have like a new OpenSSL bug every week. That's pretty important, so you need to keep OpenSSL updated. We have a lot of researchers who are working on TLS issues, so we have new vulnerabilities exposed. We need to watch these things. And I want to emphasize this point with reading an excerpt from what Ladar Levinson from the LavaBit company had to say about this. In his own words, he said, "When I was designing the LavaBit encrypted storage feature in 2004, it simply wasn't possible for an attacker to intercept and decipher a large number of SSL connections in real time. This assumption was presumed true even if an attacker managed to gain access to the SSL private key. The situation has obviously changed. Network tools now decipher SSL connections efficiently, and servers are fast enough to make this attack a reality." He concluded, "A theoretical weakness became practical." And he said, "I missed that development." So I'd ask you, as you implement TLS out in the world, maintain yourself as being one of the 32%ers, maintain your TLS config, stay up on these developments, constantly run your site through SSL Labs so you understand how well it's performing, and make changes as needed. Thank you so much. I know this was a really long presentation. This is a lot to get through. I hope you found it valuable. My slides are here at speakerdeck.com/TolmanZ. It's a big URL, but if you just go to speakerdeck.com/TolmanZ, it's the first talk there. There's a couple that are titled the same thing, but this is a longer version of other talks that I've done in the past. If anybody during the conference, if you want some consultation on TLS, I love looking at these things. I love kind of hacking at it, so come talk to me and we'll get it figured out. So thank you, everyone.